To begin. Our meeting goals, so in your packets, your binders and the binders that are on the table by the door, you can get some of the materials are also available online. So what are the goals for today's meeting? To discuss potential work group recommendations to the scope, umbrella question, and work plan, understand the current code and overview, understand the past processes surrounding URMs, again, an overview. Understand the historical context of racist planning in Portland, an overview. Electing chairs and co-chairs. There'll be chairs and co-chairs for each of the two subcommittees. There's the for-profit subcommittee and the non-profit subcommittee. They'll each be appointing their own chairs and co-chairs. We'll have an opportunity for public comment period, and we'll discuss next steps. As I indicated last month, this meeting is being audio recorded. The little recorder is in the middle of the room on the organ table, so we're in good shape there. What's the agenda? This is the 3 o'clock welcoming and reviewing the agenda, some housekeeping, and to set the tone for the scope discussion. Then from 3:30 to 4, we'll hear about the current code from BDS. Again, this is not chapter and verse. This is building code light. It's not designed by them to go into every nuance, but it is to provide a general overview. And the same is true for the 415 item, which are what happened during the final the former processes, and a look at city resiliency. The next is a working dinner, and then we'll have the historical context of racist planning in Portland, some public comment, and then I'll refacilitate the discussion about the group direction on the scope. We'll elect some chairs and co-chairs, next steps, and adjourn. One of my New Year's resolutions was to introduce a new word, at least to me, at every work group meeting. So today's new word, let's see if anyone has heard of this. It's called bloviate. It's a verb, it's informal, and it means talk at length, especially in an inflated or empty way. Now, this was given to me by someone. I don't know what the meta message is there, but I promise to do as little bloviating as I can, but you, of course, are encouraged to do so. The reminders, we have commitments for community, and they're basically be respectful. We're here to explore this as opposed to debate it. We're here to hear everyone's voice and to allow them to say what's true for them without reprisals. So let's do our best job in speaking one at a time, not talking over each other, raising your name tense on the edge, which will be my cue or the cue of the speaker to call on you in the rough order that we saw going forward. We have this evening some new members that weren't at the first meeting. And for those of you who were at the first meeting, you know the initiation ritual that we went through and the hazing exercises that we put all of you through. So I think it's only fair that the new people need to be hazed / welcomed as well. So up on the screen here, we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves to us if you weren't at the last meeting. We're going to ask you to tell us if you're on the for-profit or nonprofit committee. Which interest group are you most aligned with based upon your nomination? So it's community design, finance, historic preservation, etc. And a little bit about why this work is important to you. And then we'll do a couple more exercises, but we want to get everyone to have a chance to participate. So who was not able to attend the first meeting that's here now? So Mary Rain. So,
you want me to take it away?
Yeah, just like opening dance number, And so apparently the microphones, you don't have to get right close unless you're sitting over here, apparently. So and there's 2 per person, so we hope you share. So left-hand column, for-profit, nonprofit, interest group, what have you.
Okay, so I don't know if this is on.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm Mary Rain O'Mara, Director of Real Estate Development at Central City Concern. So I'm representing the nonprofit category. And I could check a lot of those interest groups, being a developer, where you're a building owner, work with finance, historic preservation, but probably the main one is the nonprofit multifamily. And that's why this work is important to me and to my organization, Central City Concern. We were founded in 1979 in Old Town, and a lot of our portfolio are URM buildings and house vulnerable low-income residents. Do you want me to go through the rest?
No, we'll do that later. Thank you. Robert, you're next up as our...
Sure. So my name is Robert Jepson. I guess for-profit. I work for a company named Lease Crutcher Lewis. We are a commercial contractor in the city of Portland and extended up to Seattle, Washington. My interest group, I would say really all of them. I'd say I'm kind of split down the middle as being a contractor, hoping to provide some insight on both sides of the gamut, whether it's from a cost perspective and what it takes to undertake an upgrade to a building, but also understanding the financial impacts of the people that hadn't prepared for that. So what's important to me really is finding an equitable way to manage ourselves through this to where everybody can come together and agree upon a common path that takes into mind people's investments, but also takes into account public safety.
Thank you. Welcome. Annette.
Hello, I'm Annette Stanhope. I'm with Historic Park Rose, which is a neighborhood prosperity initiative. So I fall into the nonprofit category. I can also check off a variety of different boxes there, as our nonprofit is involved with economic development, but we're economic development for all. So, we're supporting storefront improvement grants, so we're supporting our property owners, but we're also looking out for our businesses that are going to be using those properties. We have a variety of different uses for the URM buildings in our district, everything from Luke Dorff nonprofit to a mechanic shop run by a Vietnamese family. It runs the whole gamut. So, we're trying to look out for the interests of everyone in our district and find out what's the best solution for everyone.
Thank you. Welcome. Mark.
Mark Stevenson, Chief Financial Officer at Craft 3. We're a nonprofit community development financial institution, and we make capital loan investments in small businesses and nonprofits that don't have access to traditional capital throughout the state of Oregon and Washington. I would be representing the finance, I think, part of the interest group, and the work is important to us because it does align with our mission of economic development and resilience.
Great, welcome, and thank you very much. So for the 4 of you that... oh, I'm sorry, Tom, I forgot you were not here last time.
Hey, I'm Tom Schustrom. I represent Building Owners and Managers Association. I do public affairs work for them. Building Owners and Managers Association is made up of, in the interest group, primarily investors, developers, building owners, those kinds of properties. We have about 55 million square feet under membership, so it's an organization that is very much interested in in the outcome of this committee and in life safety. Those are all things that our owners are really interested in, and so I'm in the for-profit subcommittee.
Yeah, welcome. Any more members? Oh yes, Shirley.
Sorry, I'm a bit late. Traffic was terrible. My name is Shirley Chalupa. I am a structural engineer. I'm a principal at a DCI Engineers, which is a structural engineering firm, and I've done numerous projects in town, seismic retrofit with different types of performance levels. So I feel like my knowledge with the code and practical knowledge of what we've done in the past projects could benefit this group.
Welcome, thank you. So the 6 new members, just by show of hands, to get an idea, I'll ask you some of the questions we asked last week. How many of you live in North Portland? 1. How many of you live in Northeast Portland? 4. How many of you live in South Portland? That's now the new waterfront area. How many of you live in the Southeast? Okay. How about Southwest? And anyone from the Northwest? Great. All right, and how many of you own or manage a URM? And this is for everybody. How many of you own or manage a URM? Okay. How many of you live in a URM? Okay, great, thanks so much. Pastor Hennessy, did you want to make a welcoming comment?
I'd be happy to. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll try this again. You're in a Baptist church. I'm a Baptist preacher. Even if you are not a person of faith, we are here together as neighbors and brothers and sisters. And it just so happens that you're in this house on the day of my birthday.
Hey, hey.
We're grateful to have you here. I want you to know that. And we thank you for choosing to be with us today. We, by the way, also have a great deal of interest and concern about where this committee goes as it relates to the URM recommendations that will be made. I do want you to know that we not only have that interest, but we look forward to being an active participant as well. Pastor Tate, who has been a representative, I think, in this around this space, as well as Pastor Hills, were both out of town today and could not be here. But I wanted to come for a moment. I was grateful that John and the group wanted me to tell you just a moment, because I know you've got far pressing business than to hear me talk about this building. But you are in a building that has been added to the National Register of Historic Places at the national level as well as at the state level since 2016. This church was built in 1909. We celebrated its 100th birthday now nearly, 10 years ago. We were not the first church to be in this building. Interestingly enough, for those who enjoy history, who enjoys history? Oh, well, good. I was going to say, if there were only 2 of you, I can stop right now. But I won't talk for too long. But I want you to know it's interesting history. Our church was founded in, 1944 in the...
All right, some housekeeping items. We are going to call the roll, and I'm going to do it by subcommittee. So for-profit first, Peter Angel. Here. Pippa Arend. Here. David Bay. Here. Anthony. Here. Shirley. Here. David Chown. Here. Abe Farkas. Here. Maya. Here. Robert Jepson.
Here.
Kathy Rogers.
Here.
John Russell. I understand he's coming a bit late. Vic. I see you.
Yep.
Hi. Tom Sortram. Here. Annette. Here. There you are. And Bart, right over here. All right, let's go to the nonprofit folks. Thomas is here. Thomas Aquinas DePoor. Here. Jennifer Eggers. Here. Don Eggleston. Here. Carolina Gomez. Absent. We know that Pastor Walter Hills, Pastor Mark Jackson, and Pastor Tate were not able to attend. Let's see, Sue Levine was unable to attend. Mary Rain, we know, is here. She introduced herself. Andrew Smith, no? And there you have it. If you haven't yet, please turn in your conflict of interest forms, the signed versions. We have the electronic versions, the signed versions to Miriam. Miriam, do the Rose Festival wave. And at the break, give them to her so they are available. Next, housekeeping item is you got some materials that were on your desk, and whatever color this is, fuchsia maybe, that material goes behind tab 2 of your packets because it's meeting 2. And then this orangish color goes tab 12. Those materials go there. And the stuff that's before the yellow, which was the names of members on our committee, there was a couple typos, that goes behind tab 1, and you can take out the old one and put in the new one. I believe the only error is we had Abe affiliated with the wrong subcommittee, and that since has been corrected. And if any assistance, Miriam has graciously volunteered to help with that. Thank you for the meeting evaluations. They were summarized and placed behind the meeting notes, and we will try to be as responsive to them as possible. The one comment that was a suggestion that I'll present for the order is that one member suggested there was a lot of cell phone use and a lot of looking at laptops and what have you during the meeting. And so we understand if you're working on materials that you're downloading, that makes sense. But if you're looking at your astrological sign and your forecasts and your perhaps not so much. We sent out, there's a separate tab that has all of the public comments, which are in the form of emails, that were sent to the URM website. And we added one from a gentleman, Jim Kelly. Do any work group members have any comments or questions about or responses to any of the public comments that were submitted during the website? If you do, just put your name 10 up. I'll call on you and put them in the notes. Seeing none, we'll move on. Meeting 1 notes. We put together the notes for meeting 1 and sent them out in advance. Any additions, subtractions, corrections, or multiplications to the meeting notes? Hearing none, they'll be approved by nonverbal acclamation. So in the binders, you have your COI forms. We added them. We added the ones from Jennifer Eggers, Abe Farkas, and Robert Jepson. They will be in your packets. For those of you who haven't had time to fill them out, we would strongly encourage you to look in your packet. You'll find that another blank form. Fill that out and please give it to Miriam. It's essential as part of the public official training you received in December as a basis to declare apparent and actual conflicts of interest and vote accordingly. Member sign-in sheets. Miriam, were those passed around or were they at the front desk? The member sign-in sheets for the workgroup members. You gave it to me. That was a mistake of near biblical importance. Well, we'll find those and pass them out. And members of the public, hopefully you had sign-in sheets up there as well. And please, if you want to do public comment, please sign your name as possible. I call on people in the order they signed up. And then there are binders there that have the materials from the first and second meeting, that have the materials with the conflict of interest disclosure forms, and a book that was being provided by the city. Some of you have asked what happened to the Civic Life HR video, and the answer and the policy that they asked you to read, and the answer is we don't know yet, but we're checking into it, and we will let you know as soon as possible. Next sign-in item is that during the Q&A, the presenters will tell you as they come up whether or not they would like you to wait And hold your questions at the end, or would they mind being asked during it? And again, the protocol is to move your placard up, and they will call on you in the order, or I will assist depending on the volume. It looks like the worksheet's going around now. Thank you, Miriam. Again, for those of you who met me the first time, I like to model compulsive transparency and sincerity, especially as it relates to ethics issues. And one of the members of the work group sent me a box with a letter in it after the first meeting. And in essence, it said that you looked so tired after that first meeting. I really felt sorry for you, and it appears that you need help after these meetings. And he provided me with the actual fair market value cost a bottle of Courvoisier. And because I believe in, again, the public rules, I have got an eyedropper, and each of you get 1/27th of this bottle, which I will be passing around. So thank you, Vic, for your kindness. All right, what's next? So let's talk about the council-approved bylaws and purpose. So here they are on the screen here. They're also here. We've talked about them pretty much in depth. Recommendations to reduce life safety risks posed by URM buildings and reduce displacement. Develop recommendations that are financial and policy supports to promote seismic retrofits, recognizing unique needs of commercial and nonprofit owners, standards for participation in voluntary support programs, not required or expected, to recommend mandatory retrofits that are privately owned. It is expected that support for voluntary retrofits be scaled to need. During my initial interviews with folks, given the homework over the past couple months that you've sent in, listening to some of the public comments received, some of the offline conversations I've had with some of you, or many of you, offline, the thought occurred to me that I wanted to bring this to your attention and set this up just very directly and very overtly. And so if you can give me about 3 or 4 minutes to walk through this, and then I'll open it up to some discussion. But I think if I have an uninterrupted opportunity to create the big picture, it may well happen. So based on all that material, there's been, in essence, several suggestions to change the city council approved purpose or scope. And I really just want to put on the table and give you the opportunity to make recommendations that you, the work group, as individuals and as a group, think the city council needs to hear. I recommend, before we have that conversation, that we have this meeting today, so everyone has at least some, not all, and I suspect some of the comments and presentations that will be made will be controversial, but some understanding of the current code, the prior processes, and the history of racist planning in Portland. There are some of you that know more about this than I'll ever know. Some of you are new to the process, and some of you are in between. And we're not yet at a place in my facilitator judgment, which is not infallible, but my facilitator judgment, to have enough information to talk about this with the same common understanding. After we have the presentations today, at the end of this meeting, we'll discuss at meeting 3 and 4 whether you want to make a different purpose or scope recommendation to council. You could decide at the end of this meeting or at the end of the next meeting that no, the status quo scope is fine, or you could decide you as a group want to make some changes. Before we finish today, I'll take an informal poll on what other background foundational information do you need need or want to make recommendations. For instance, I'll ask you about, do you want to hear about earthquake risks? Do you want to hear about building risks? Do you want to hear about the viability of the financial options that have been studied to date? Do you want to hear about to what extent, if any, there is city funding? And we'll tee that up, and depending on the zen of the room here, decide whether or not to do that at meeting 3. And then, depending on your decision at the next meeting, we'll decide whether or not you want to go back to City Council, because you just can't change the scope or purpose by yourselves. You have to make a recommendation to City Council to do it. So under, again, the category of transparency, here is some, read here, some, not all, not nuanced. All of this conversation is very nuanced, but we don't have the time or space to do it and get through. Let me give you an idea of what I've heard so far, and then I promise to call on you, Anthony. So what have I heard on the left? The scope says council seismic retrofits. I've heard feedback from the group that says, no, let's broaden it to include overall resiliency, not just limited to the URM subset, but look broader to overall resiliency of the city. I've heard we're supposed to do financial inputs. Some of you have said, this was studied in depth during the last processes, didn't go anywhere, it didn't have legs, it's not likely to go anywhere now. Why are we doing a year-long process if the status quo from the last time is the same and there's no new funds or information or resources? We're supposed to do policy and administrative support work. Some of you have said, well, that doesn't really move the needle much. So we have an express line. I'm making this part up. So we have an express line at the BDS for URM permitting. Okay, that's nice, but really does that move the needle and really help building owners? Does that encourage people to do retrofits? Does it make it affordable to do retrofits? So if we're to do things like that, more policy, programmatic things, that doesn't need to be done in a 27-person task force facilitated by a very talented, good, facilitator, yeah. Commercial and nonprofit, it's limited to commercial and nonprofit. Folks have said, are you kidding me? What about class 1 and 2? What about the city-owned buildings? Back in 2018, City Council said we should do our own buildings, and the city, for reasons they'll discuss, haven't done their own buildings. And so why are you limiting it to what we have here when you should also include class 1 and 2?
Can you define class 1 and 2 for people who don't know what they are?
Okay, so Ahmed, I'm going to let you do that because you're more savvy. So introduce yourself and then class 1, 2, 3, and 4.
You want to use the microphone?
Yeah, come up and use the microphone. Ahmed, pop quiz. What are the 4 classes?
Okay, so this was again a part of the process that went through from 2014 to 2018. As part of that process, they classified all URM buildings into 4 different classes based on its use, its occupancy, and whether it needs to be functional after an earthquake. So class 1 buildings are those buildings that are classified as critical buildings. These typically would be something like fire stations, police stations, hospitals, that kind of stuff in there. Class 2 buildings would be high occupancy structures, which would be things like schools, churches, community centers, and that kind of stuff. It's really, really high occupancy building. And then we had, I'll skip URM class 3, URM class 4 buildings are low occupancy structures, generally things like auto garages where you have like maybe up to 10 people in there. And class 3 would be all other types of buildings that are not class 1, class 2, or class 4 buildings in there. So those would be your typical apartment types of buildings or business use buildings in there. So if that helps.
So testing, for clarity then, right now we are on 3 and 4. We're supposed to be doing 3 and 4.
This committee is,
This is an expansion by some members of the public to say we should add to our scope 1 and 2. So it would be all 4 classes, just not the 2. All right, so some of the considerations, if we're to broaden to overall resiliency, we're going to need other agencies involved, not just PBEM and BDS, and we might have different stakeholders or additional stakeholders because, for instance, if we're adding one or two, class 1 and 2, we would want members of those buildings present on the work group, because it wouldn't be fair to talk behind their back. We'd have them here. Financial, if we say this committee scope shouldn't deal with financial, we run the risk of missing a financial option that no one has thought of or is new or is viable coming forth. And some of the people I've talked about said there's not possibly another financial option available in the history of civilization. We've looked at all of them ad nauseum, and they're just not there. Same with policy. There could be a great policy support issue that comes up that we would miss if we do it forward. Again, adding class 1 and 2, we'd have to bring in different stakeholders, as I mentioned. There are some city budget realities that don't bode well for funding class 1 and 2 buildings. And council has already required upgrades to be mandated on class 1 or 2 buildings. What else did I hear? This voluntary issue. Some folks have said, no, these rules that this work group works on should be mandatory, because if they're not mandatory, nothing will get done. People won't retrofit their buildings. So if we're really serious about life safety, we should expand our charge to include mandatory. The problem with that, and these are my perspectives, not yours, I'm not putting words in, is I don't think there's any political support for that in the current city council. I'm not even sure there's support for that in this work group by way of a majority. The standards for participation in any voluntary program, to what standard? Meaning how much retrofit, to what level of retrofit? Well, the concern about that is if this group gets standards to get money for voluntary retrofits, that could leak into down the road mandatory standards. And so if that's going to happen, it should be cards up, face up, and not in the back door. Eligibility prioritization, everyone knows, unless the city engages in the Powerball lottery and wins and gets a big Powerball and devotes it to URMs. Coming up with a priority system isn't as academic if we don't know how much money we are going to play with. And then some people have said we should add the list or the inventory. It's not in the resolution per se, but it has been stated so by staff. And so what have they said? Make changes to the list, verify accuracy, eliminate it altogether. Out the door, okay? And what we miss if we do something different is a way to improve that process. So that's what I think I've heard. I just want you to, I'll answer a few questions for clarification, but I just want you to think with it. We're not going to debate this right now. We're going to get everyone on the same page with the 3 substantive presentations. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about this. But I really want you to engage in a discussion because it's your committee. It's your advice to city councils that matters. And see and ask ourselves critically, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How likely are we to succeed? Is there a different or better way? So that's the goal. So a couple of questions. Anthony, you had yours from previously?
Yeah. Is this working? Okay, cool. My feedback from the homework on the purpose, scope, and essential questions was not included in the handout that we were all passed out. Is there a reason for that?
It would only be accidental. There was absolutely no reason. I believe that on the umbrella question that we got from you, it was in a Google Doc that got attached, and it didn't seem like there were any changes. But Miles here, Miles, Rose Festival Wave, do the Rose Festival Wave. If you two get together at the break, we'll make sure that gets updated as early as tomorrow.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments on this framing? All right, so next up, is the current regulations and policy processes, 2014 to 19. Amit, I'll give you this one. And then while you're getting that adjusted, do you want them to hold their questions or ask questions as you go?
I would prefer that they hold the questions to the end.
So if you'd be so kind as to hold your questions to the end, just put your name tag up so I know you're in the queue if you have any questions or comments. He's got about a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, yes, Vic.
I personally feel, just my personal, that when someone's giving a presentation, okay, anybody, if I don't understand something and I have to wait till the end of the presentation to ask a question, in a sense, I have wasted all this time before understanding what they want. So I think, like, instead of saying leave all questions till the end, okay, where you need clarification, I would like to suggest that we be able to ask for clarification, only clarification.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So this is a frequent and a good suggestion, so we will open up the question for clarification. Having said that, you've all been in meetings where the questions for clarification go something like this. Ms. Rogers, isn't it true that?
No.
And it's really a waterboarding, cross-examining, making a point kind of thing. And I do courses on how to do that offline. $29.95. No. So let's really try to say, help me understand, not end up with, well, I disagree because.
Right.
We'll say that to you. On your mark, get set, enlighten.
All right. Thanks. Again, just to reintroduce myself, my name is Amit Kumar. I am a supervising structural engineer with the BDS at the City of Portland. What I wanted to talk a little bit today about is what the current code is and what the regulations are regarding seismic upgrades to existing building. But before I get into that, we just wanted to talk some very basic information, which I think for a lot of you would be really basic, but may be beneficial to some others. So if you could just bear with me for a few slides as I talk about some basic information here. So as most of you are aware, that any buildings or any structure in the city, whether it's new or it's existing, that is undergoing alterations or repairs, has to meet certain building codes. These building codes are either state building codes or city building codes in here. And they're all modeled on national standards or national codes. So in Oregon, we have a statewide building code that all jurisdictions are supposed to apply uniformly. And that, for a structural code, is the Oregon Structural Specialty Code. Now, we have for other trades like plumbing, mechanical, electrical, different codes for that too. But they are based on the International Building Code, which is a code that is a national code, which applies to all the entire U.S. and also is used in other countries too. So what happens is the state takes the international building codes, makes some amendments for local conditions in here, and then is called as the Oregon Structural Specialty Code. It's essentially the international building code. So currently the code is the 2019 version of the Oregon Structural.
My new muscle cars
and then the cities also adopt certain local rules and regulations. And in the City of Portland, for the building code, it's what is called as Title 24. And embedded in Title 24 is Chapter 24.85, which deals with seismic design of existing buildings. And that's where most of our regulations for existing buildings reside, not just URMs, but all existing buildings. And that's what I'll be talking to about down the road in this presentation. And these codes are updated on a regular basis. So for the International Building Code and the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, it's a 3-year cycle. So every 3 years, based on new knowledge, new technology, or our experience with the use of previous codes. So all that is incorporated into new codes every year, so they're updated every year. In the earlier editions of the code, which at that time was a uniform building code, we are talking about like in 1980s, the code sort of categorized or classified different areas of the country into what is called as seismic zones. So those were based on what the risk or the expected seismic activity is in that area in there. And they classified it into zones 1 through 4. Zone 1 being the lowest expected seismic activity, and zone 4 being the highest seismic activity in there. So that's what the seismic zones were at that point. Those we don't have anymore. They're not there, but because we basically now, instead of categorizing every area, you can pick any point, and then we have hazard maps for that particular location there. But this is all based on research work that's done by the USGS, or US Geological Survey. And so based on their research, they classify these buildings into different seismic zones. So just a very brief history about codes in Oregon. The first statewide code in Oregon was adopted in 1974. Before that, the city of Portland had its own code, but the statewide was first adopted in 1974. And at that time, for seismic zones, it was like what we call a seismic zone 2, which is like a moderate seismic risk in there. But further research by geologists and seismologists, they found that the Pacific Northwest is more susceptible, is a higher risk for seismic activity. And so in 1990, they changed the zone classification from zone 2 to zone 2B. So what that means is, so if you look, so this is one of the parameters that we design buildings for, which is the forces that you design a building for. Or in very layman terms, it's what the building shaking is expected at that location. So if we take this as the base for the forces that we were supposed to design in 1980s, in 1990, when we changed to the Oregon OSSC, that meant when we went from zone 2 to zone 2B, we are now suddenly designing all buildings to about 150% of what we were designing till 1980, in the late 1980s. So that was the first change that happened. And I'm going to go back to this. But then further research said that, yeah, we are really in a high-risk seismic zone. So what they did was they upped the zone from zone 2B to zone 3. So that was in 1993, Uniform Building Code. And so what that did then was, instead of now designing for this level, now you're designing it to that level, which is about 230% of what we designed in the 1980s. Now this is significant because the city of Portland had what was called as a dangerous building code at that time. And the dangerous building code required that all existing buildings have a capacity of at least 2/3 of what is required by current code. So when this zone change happened, now you're designing for 230%, that meant that every building that was there, that was designed till the 1993, or the codes before 1993, was considered dangerous. So what do you do with that then? So the city council, and at that time I think it was Commissioner Gretchen Gafuri, appointed a seismic task force to figure out to look at these existing buildings, how vulnerable these buildings are, and to provide recommendations on how to fix these buildings in there. And actually we have a couple of members from that committee at that time on this committee today. So their work resulted in what we have now as Chapter 24.85 in Title 24, the seismic design of existing building, which I had mentioned earlier, and I'm going to talk about it later on. And that, this 2485 was then updated in 2004, and then again, as part of the previous exercise that began in 2014, again, we had some strengthened the triggers in 2018. But those triggers that we added in 2018 were part of an ordinance that also included placarding and tenant notification, which, because of the lawsuit, was repealed, and now, so essentially, the regulations we have are what we had in 2004. So that's what the standard is for seismic triggers in 2485 is what we had in 2004. I wanted to just go back and talk a little bit about this chart again, because we have received a lot of questions about, people saying that they have the buildings were designed in the 80s or seismically retrofit in the 80s, so why is it still considered not upgraded in there? And that's essentially because of, essentially because of, you see, we are now designing for buildings about 310% of what we were in the 1980s. So those buildings, even though they may have been upgraded at that time, are still very vulnerable to an earthquake. And when you're designing for almost 300% of what we were at that time. Just very, very quickly here, just for some terminology, there's things about people are asking is like, what does a parapet mean? There you go. So a parapet is essentially the extension of the exterior wall that goes above the roof line. And then you know what roof, wall, exterior wall is, and then the floor. Why are URM buildings vulnerable to an earthquake? Now, these buildings have been generally typically built before 1960s and late 1800s. They are old, archaic materials. They, they have deteriorated in the mortar in these between the blocks that are there are deteriorated, and so those could easily fall apart. These buildings are also heavy buildings, and in an earthquake, these buildings, when the heavier buildings see a lot more shaking than a lighter building like a wood frame building in there. But one of the main things about a URM building is when they were built, they were not, the floors were not attached to the walls. So as you can imagine, when you have a seismic shaking, the walls and the floors could separate and could cause partial collapse on the buildings. And one of the more vulnerable aspects that we see in a lot of buildings is this parapet. That's this extension of the exterior wall. We see that time after time in earthquakes, even in modern earthquakes, that these parapets would collapse, and people on their sidewalks are impacted by that collapse in there. So those are some of the vulnerabilities of in a URM building. So now coming back to what are the requirements in current code for seismic upgrade of existing building. Now just remember, this is not just for URM buildings, but it's for any existing building in there. So if an owner decides they don't want to do anything to the building, there's no change of occupancy or use, there's no requirement for a seismic upgrade. Only if an owner changes its use and occupancy, and I'll define that a little bit in a future slide, what that means, or if they are making an alteration that exceeds a certain cost threshold, or they're doing some sort of re-roof, only then are they required to do some seismic upgrades. So these are called passive triggers. So only if you trigger that, you're required to do, otherwise there's no requirement for any kind of seismic upgrades. So what are these triggers, right? So the first trigger is what we call is the change in use or change of occupancy. So every building is assigned, based on its use, an occupancy category. For example, if you have a building that is used mostly for, let's say, as a community center, or is used as a theater, so they are assigned what is called an A assembly. If it is used mostly for businesses, it's called a B. If it's used for storage, it's called an S or F assembly. So Title 2485 basically classifies these buildings based on the hazard categories. So buildings that are S or F are considered low hazard categories because they are just essentially storage. Whereas you have buildings like community centers, because there's exposure, more exposure, then a lot more people congregate, they're called A assembly. They're on the higher classification. Same thing with schools, they are on the higher classification. So if a building undergoes a change of occupancy from a lower hazard, let's say from a storage to a business, that's going from a lower to a higher hazard, and that change occupies more than 33% of the building, then you're required to do a seismic upgrade. So that's one trigger. The other trigger is change in occupancy, adding occupants to the building. So again, the code has assigned occupant load, which is like, for an assembly building, for example, you have, for every 15 square feet, you can expect there's one person that is there. So you can calculate what the maximum occupancy based on the occupant, how you're using it. So if you change an occupancy, and that occupancy causes an increase in occupant load of more than 150 people, then that's another trigger that you have to do a seismic upgrade. The last trigger in there is for change of occupancy to an essential facility, which is, again, if you're changing the occupancy of the building so that now it's used for a fire station or police station, that's an essential facility, then it requires a seismic upgrade. Again, these triggers apply to all buildings, not just URMs. Now, in 1996, I think when the Seismic Task Force that created this Title 24, they did recognize that URM buildings are more vulnerable to an earthquake. So they have some triggers that apply only to unreinforced masonry buildings. And the first trigger is the cost trigger. So if you're doing a repair or an alteration, and the cost exceeds certain thresholds over a 2-year time frame, then you're required to do a seismic upgrade. But again, this is only to URM buildings. Typically, when you do a retrofit to an existing building, or URM, there are different elements to it. So depending on the building type and its deficiencies that there exists, some of these will apply, either some or all of them do. So the first thing that you would do, you might want to do, is brace this parapet, because that's one of the things that's most vulnerable in an earthquake. Tying the walls to the roof, tying the walls to the floor. These exterior walls also during the shaking could collapse, and so you would brace those for what we call as out-of-plane bracing. And then you see these big X's in here. That's just an illustration to show that the building as a whole has to be braced for a seismic zone. It's not necessary to put big steel braces. There are other methods to do it, like concrete walls and stuff like that. So these are just some elements of a seismic retrofit. Depending on the building type, some or all or none of them may apply.
Excuse me. So the way I understood it is like going from the level of, let's call it most danger, like A would be the first thing you would do. B would be, if you can go the next step, it would be B. I mean, is it like a range?
No, it's not. It just depends on what the deficiency is on the building. But you are right, as far as the parapets that we are there, that are the most vulnerable in a URM building. And even like in a small earthquake, that's the first thing that you'll see that's a problem. But again, if you have a small parapet, may not be that big an issue, whereas if it's a tall parapet, that could be a big issue. So it just depends on what is the building deficiency in that case.
Thanks.
So another requirement that is there, a trigger for unreinforced masonry buildings, is when you do remove the existing roofing and replace it with new roofing, and that replacement is for 50% or more of the area over a 5-year time frame, then you are required to basically brace the parapet and attach the wall to the roof. So that's all that is required when you do the re-roofing of the building in there. Again, that is only required when you take what is there out and put something new. So if you're just putting something over an existing, then it doesn't trigger.
The previous slide applied to all buildings, and this slide applies to URMs only?
This again was just a typical retrofit that I have mentioned for, it could apply to any building or just URMs. But the triggers that I mentioned, for this trigger applies only to URMs, whereas these triggers that I mentioned apply to any building.
Got it, thank you.
And this trigger for re-roofing applies only to URM buildings too.
Amit,
Yeah.
this, on slide 20, you say replaces more than half of a roof. Is that within a 2-year period? Is that the difference between that?
You're talking
and
about
the
this?
5-year period?
No, so this is a cost trigger.
No, to slide 20.
This?
Replaces more than half a roof.
Right, so that's what I'm talking about is in this one here.
Right, but that one applies to all buildings.
No.
That only URMs.
The roof applies to only to URMs. This is, I was just talking about in general on this slide. So the roof replacement applies only to URMs, not all buildings. So there are other provisions in the code, like when you do an alteration and the cost of the alteration exceeds a certain amount, right now that number is $272,000. What I forgot to mention earlier was in this slide, we have these cost triggers. These triggers all are adjusted on an annual basis based on the cost of construction increase. So you'll see this number now. I think we are just looking at what it is for the coming year. This will change every year. So same thing in this, when you do, and if a cost exceeds a certain amount, and again, this applies to all buildings, not just URMs, you are required to do an evaluation of a building. And you do it once, you don't have to keep doing it for every permit. And again, this doesn't trigger any seismic upgrades, it's just an evaluation that needs to be done. Some other requirements is there is a provision in Title 24 that we can phase a seismic upgrade over a 10-year time frame.
That $272,000, is that over a certain period of time? Say
It's
5
for that
years?
one permit.
For the one permit?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a provision that we could, if the director of BDS approves, that you could phase this permit over a 10-year time frame. And then there's also fee reductions that are allowed for a certain amount of fees can be either waived or reduced for seismic upgrades.
Roughly, how much does that pencil out to on average in terms of money saved?
The fee reductions?
The fee reductions.
So the way it's worded right now is that if your total fees exceed $2,500, then you get half the fee reduced. If it is less than $2,500, then all that fee is reduced. So it just depends on the value of your work in there. So finally, I think I just want to conclude. Basically, we have had Title 2485 since 1996. That's about 25 years or so. So roughly, we have about 20% of the URM buildings have either been fully upgraded or they've gone through partial upgrades, like attaching the wall to the floor, to the roof, or bracing the parapets, or they have been demolished. So we have about 80% of our URM buildings that have not gone through any kind of retrofits in here.
Go to the city, show what the city.
Yeah, so city owns about 49 buildings, of which I think about 19 of them are just public restrooms, a single small story buildings. And of those, 5 of them have been fully upgraded, 6 are partially upgraded, and 1 is in progress right now.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So 5 of those buildings, the 49 buildings, have been fully upgraded. 6 are partially upgraded, and 1 of them is under upgrade right now.
Out of 49.
Or the 49. And like I said, 19 of those are basically public restrooms.
Does the city have a plan in place to do is there a timeline that they're working on with a schedule of getting them done, or is it just kind of when the money's available, or what's the standard?
Right, so at this point, then there's no plan has been developed at this point right now.
Okay.
So that is it.
Right, so that's, I don't have my glasses, so I'll come. So HIPAA and Annette, and then
So when so this has been being worked on since 1995, it sounds like. When were building owners notified
About.
that they have a URM building?
So my understanding was when this URM database was created, there was some notification sent out to URM building owners at that point saying that your building is a URM building.
In 2015, right?
No, in 1996 is when it was first done.
I think the URM
Excuse me for interrupting, I think that is.
Yes, let's not interrupt. Put your name, Tina, I'll call in here.
Okay.
So-
Pip, you're still
So
on.
as a building owner, I was not notified, I can tell you that. And I also I noted that in your slide of the timeline, one piece that I think is really critical that was omitted is the roofing permit piece that was implemented in 1994, where roofing bundles were sold to roofers.
Right.
Because we know that that put the onus of knowing if the building is a URM or not onto the roofer.
Right.
And if I can I quote you in a 2017 email where you say, looks like our inspections did not enforce Title 2485 to brace parapets and attach wall to roof. Unfortunately, I don't think this is an isolated incident, as our inspection staff routinely sold re-roof permits through the minor label program without enforcing the requirements. So I just wanted to note that, because through this, you say 80% of buildings are not retrofitted from now since 1996, and it's sort of implied that the building owners are doing this intentionally, but I would like to counter, as myself a building owner, who did a full re-roof right around this time, full permits, full city inspection, with no mention of the word URM to me. So it just seems like if the city could enforce their own permit process, which I know actually for fact they're still not doing, that would actually solve a lot of this. We wouldn't need to be here today. So
Yeah,
what's
I
your thoughts
mean,
on
there
that?
was no implication in my presentation that URM owners are the ones responsible for that.
Oh, should I quote you from the Mercury where you imply that we are?
Well, there are other provisions in the code that people try to get around, like the 33% of the thing. So we routinely get permits that are there, that they're changing occupancy to less than 33% of the the area. So those kind of stuff in there. So there was no implication, at least in here in this presentation, to do that. But yes, there have been cases where our inspectors have not been enforcing that, and we are taking steps to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Don, why don't you make your clarification, even though it's out of order, if you don't mind, because it's on the same topic. Did you have something?
Yes, I was going to add that since I chaired that committee in 93 and 96, there existed before that the URM inventory that is very outdated. Now, whether or not building owners were notified or not, I don't know, but that inventory has been around, and it started, I think, with about 1,740, and it's down to about 1,640 now. And it was kind of a, I'll say, drive-by inventory done. So if you really want to drill down to find out how many URMs you have and what their conditions are, it needs to be a very in-depth inventory of every building, which that list does not show.
I agree.
So-
Just as an addendum, I still have not been notified at all by the city
Yeah,
about
no, I
anything.
mean, I'm just telling you that that's what that list was created from, and I have no knowledge of what notification there was.
Thank you.
Don, I'm just curious, when you were on that committee, did they have PowerPoints in? Or Word?
No, it was all notebooks and sitting at tables.
Annette?
So when a property owner redoes their roof over 50%, and that triggers a seismic retrofit requirement, does the code have a standard by which they need to do this?
Yeah, again, I mean, what they're required to do is just the bracing the parapets and the attaching of the wall to the floors. And, you're required to design it to a certain force, which is determined by a standard, which is ASC 41 is what we call it. So there are forces that you design those for.
David?
Yeah, a follow-up question on, yes, I should need a microphone. A follow-up question on the list, the infamous list that every meeting I'm in, somebody brings up the list. It seems like, the list of URM buildings. And Don, I appreciate your clarification on where that list came from. I've heard the same thing, drive-by list. A couple of questions. What is that list actually used for? I mean, how much how much credence is placed on that list? Is that list used to really determine if a building is a URM? Or, I mean, if the list is that flawed, are we using it for any policy changes or per building changes? And if so, why are we relying on a list that everybody seems to agree is pretty flawed?
So let me just say the list that was created in 1996 was a starting point that we used to update that list. We undertook a process of looking at the list in 2014, starting with what we had from 1996. So some of the things that we did to update that list was to go back and look at every single record that we had on each of these buildings, look and see if we have any permits that would share information on what the building type is, or any kind of renovations that have been done, if the buildings were demolished. We had a structural engineer look at all these buildings. We didn't go into the buildings to tear down walls to look at what's inside that building. We did a visual observation through using technology such as Google Maps to update the record. Went back and looked at what we have on Sanborn maps. So we used the information that we have at our disposal to verify that list, and we did take off a bunch of buildings that were wrongly classified as URMs. A lot of it is based on visual observations, and that is the list that is, typically the process that is followed in all the cities in the country here. So Seattle went through the same process of creating an update. So yes, there is no 100% guarantee that this is a URM, but there are buildings on there that sometimes it's very difficult just by observing whether it's a veneer or is it an actual building in there. So unless you actually go into the building and tear down the finishes to look at it, there is a chance that those type of buildings are, on that list.
Is there a means, sorry, a quick follow-up, is there a means for an owner who doesn't believe their building is a URM to appeal it?
Yes, and so the process we have established is to submit whatever records you have. You can have an engineer go out and look at the building and determine whether it's unreinforced masonry or not. Provide us with any information that the owner might have that we don't have, that we can look at. We have an appeals process if the owner disagrees so they would submit it to staff, and the staff would look at it. If the owner disagrees, there's an appeals board that they can go to and appeal that. So there is a process, and we have taken out, I think about 24 buildings as of this date, based on appeals from building owners.
Thank you.
I promise to get the cards that are up. I just wanted to try to put this in focus. From the very first interview I did with folks, I heard about this list or inventory or whatever it's called. And I'm not trying to poo-poo this issue for a moment. I'm simply suggesting that in the literal words of the city charter, it does not talk about the list. And that's why I mentioned it in the scope conversation to decide if you want to do that or not, and if so, when. If we are going to have the conversation about the list, then I'm suggesting a separate standalone 45-minute presentation Q&A that's the list. And, we can all, I'll pass out the portions of the judge's decision where he, to use the legal term, poo-pooed the list. And you can all read that, and we can have a robust conversation. So I'll take a few more just to, because you're thirsty to do it, but we're running a little behind, and I would rather do the list and do it right than piecemeal it. So I lost track who called first, other than Dave has been the most patient person in the room because I've ignored him up to this point. So Dave, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, so I do know one of the building owners of the 24 that was able to get off of that. And it was just a letter from a structural engineer that said this is not an unreinforced masonry building. It was a report, and they were able to get off the list. So the question I have is, the scope of this committee is to provide incentives for voluntary seismic upgrades. If the recommendation was that we came up with a modified bolts plus, this is the most effective way to do it, could we then, the building owners or the building occupants, skirt Title 2485, saying we've already done a seismic upgrade, so we're no longer subject to the same portion? Is that an incentive that the city would consider? Like, so that we would no longer be subjected to Title 24 as an unreinforced masonry building?
So again, there are triggers in the code which say, there are different levels of upgrades that are required on the thing.
Right.
So if we do only, let's say a bolts plus upgrade as a recommendation there, but if they trigger something as a mandatory upgrade, which requires a higher level of upgrades in there, then at least currently the way it is, they would be required to do that upgrade.
Right, but would the city be willing to provide that as an incentive to unreinforced masonry buildings?
So that would be a recommendation, I think, from this committee.
So you guys would make that recommendation. You would get input from city staff when that recommendation is on the table, so you could hash it out, edit it, modify it, get their input. But ultimately, the 27 of you, if you all say, a majority of you say, yes, let's make it that way, that recommendation goes to city council. Does that help or no?
Yeah, it sounds like, sure, make the recommendation, we'll consider it.
Well, see,
Right.
yes,
Yeah.
that's true, but staff can't make, ultimately, the city council will.
Right.
I'm sure
Yeah.
they'll ask staff for staff input, and I'll ask them to tell you if you're gonna make a recommendation, whether or not they're gonna support it or not, because I don't want to have staff stay silent. You make a recommendation and then hear about their considerations later, when we could have worked them out if we surface all that in real time.
Well, Mr. Kumar is the person they're going to ask about that.
Yeah, and Jonna and other folks. All right, I'm sorry, I've totally lost. Do you guys know who Edward sent up first? Okay, so because you weren't here last time and didn't speak and monopolized the
Thank you for that generosity. My question is not about the list, so I hope it'll be accepted. Want to clarify the process by which the mandatory upgrades get assigned or identified. So current example, we're going to replace a roof on one of our URM buildings. We're hoping to stay under the seismic trigger, but for hypothetical question here, if we were to exceed the seismic trigger and then get into the area of mandatory upgrade, how would we know what elements of upgrade we were required to take? Is that through the assessment that is then part of the
I think if you're
trigger
doing,
amount?
if the only trigger is the roof replacement, the only thing that you're required to do is to brace the parapet and attach the wall to the roof.
But if the
No.
dollar amount of all permitted work, because
Yeah.
we had other
Right,
work in
so
scope that
the
we
way to do
cut.
that would be to first do an evaluation and determine what the deficiencies are. And
Is
then
that the
you-
assessment that is required by the city? Would determine that, or
So
the building owner can do a
assessment is required by the
separate?
city if you exceed that threshold of a cost that is there, right? You don't want to just go in and do a seismic upgrade where it's not necessary. So the only way to do that would be to have an engineer evaluate the building and say, my deficiency only is the walls are not strong enough for out-of-plane loads, and that's all I
Okay.
need to do.
So the city would accept our engineer's assessment to say, here are the critical elements for
Yes.
upgrade?
So there is a procedure that they have to follow, which is again through a standard, which is ASC 41 standard. There is like a checklist that they have to go through and do that, and that's what is submitted. That's part of what is a seismic upgrade when it's required on the thing, is go through the checklist, identify the deficiencies, and then upgrade those deficiencies.
Okay,
So I'm
thank
going
you.
to call on the people that haven't spoken once on this issue, so let's do Maya.
This is super quick. Back to the list.
URM, just define it really quickly, because there's unreinforced masonry, then there's concrete frame with URM infill, so just a quick reminder as to what constitutes URM, terracotta elements that could potentially fall.
So URM is, masonry is basically any, if there's one wall in the building that is a bearing wall that supports a certain load which exceeds 200 pounds a linear foot. I don't want to get too technical.
But it's
in
pretty
that thing.
technical as far as,
Yeah.
it's not as straightforward as it's a brick building.
Right,
that
and
has-
it's also, it's like, some of these masonry buildings have some reinforcement in them, but there is a requirement that it has to meet a minimum standard. So if you have some reinforcement, but it's less than that minimum there, then it's still considered unreinforced masonry also. And those are defined in the code itself. The way it's defined is that what is reinforced masonry? So for being a reinforced masonry, you have to have this amount of reinforcing in the wall. If it's less than that, then it's considered unreinforcement.
Thank you.
Shirley?
So my question is regarding the cost trigger.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you actually came up with the $46.67 per square foot. Also, from my experience, that seems like a very low number in terms of any work, any type of work, even though it has nothing to do with, altering the occupancy or changing the use of that building. I'm just wondering if that's something could be reconsidered, or where this come from originally.
So this was part of the seismic task force that came up with those numbers back in '96, and then it was changed in 2004. And the requirement in that is that it be updated annually. So that's why you see that odd number, 4637, is just because we are multiplying that by cost of inflation for cost of construction. And so that is not something that the city came up with, but it was a task force that came up with that number.
And Jepson's company will, I guarantee, to do it for less.
Just super quick comment back to David Chown. The city has said in their URM building survey project report that there was approximately 20% error in the existing data of the URM list.
Okay, thanks.
Amit, first of all, I want to compliment you on the presentation which you made. I thought it was done simply, that I think that everybody would understand that. So that was well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question, and the triggers which you pointed out are there, which currently exist. From questions from from people, I got the impression that it was not totally enforced by the city, and that was one of the areas of improvement which the cities would be working on. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the problem was with the trigger for the re-roof was there because of this roofing label bundling issue that was there. Roofing contractors would buy, they could buy labels without using it on any particular property. And then they could just buy that label and put it on any property that they wanted it in there, and then the inspection staff would have to look at that. So the inspection staff, and so there was a bit of a disconnect there, and so yes, we are working on trying to get that portion of it. Most of the time when you have these other triggers that are there, that comes through the permitting services that is there, and we are enforcing that a lot more rigorously now.
So enforcing the triggers which currently exist will result in a better percentage of buildings being upgraded. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kathy?
Yeah, I just wanted to do one last comment about the list, and then I'll drop it. But the list itself, I don't see how we can have this work group without addressing the list. The name of our work group is Unreinforced Masonry Building Work Group. So what are we even talking about if we're not talking about the list of buildings? And as an example, our building is not an unreinforced masonry building, but it's on the list. We were told by our insurance company it's not. It's a wood frame building with a brick facade. I appealed, and it took 6 months to even get initial response. Any response from the city, and the response was, well, we don't have any records, so you need to provide proof that it's not on the list. hired an engineer, $8,000 later, the city said, nope, we disagree. So it is a very important part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's why I called it out.
Yeah, and so I would like to formally propose that we address the list at some point in time, because otherwise, why are we even here?
Thomas, last call, Thomas.
Will the current level of 310 be changed in the future? I'm asking this question maybe for the purposes of recommendations later, so that we can be thinking beyond the current levels to make recommendations.
Thomas, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm saying that is the current 310 level going to be increased in the future? The standards of the 310, the seismic level.
So go back to that slide where it shows.
This one here? Is that what you're talking about,
Yeah,
the
will it be
seismic? So
increased?
the codes change like I said, every 3 years. And, that's what is required for new buildings, at least at this point, is to design for whatever the code forces are. And you can see that since, let's say from back in 1993, there have been less of an increase in there. I don't know, if they find more research, that might change, those levels might change further on. But at this point, I can't tell.
So Amit, maybe this could help clarify. So this is some national standard that you're referring to down here, those initials on the bottom are some national?
That's a code. These are the codes, the 1999 Oregon Structural Specialty Code, and then
The Oregon.
Oregon Structural Specialty, which is based on a national code.
Okay.
And you basically go to a U.S. Geological Survey site, and you're able to figure out what forces that you're supposed to design to.
And then do you just automatically adopt what the OSSC does? And do they just automatically adopt what the national folks do? I mean, how does this?
Yeah, so the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, they could make amendments to the National Building Code depending on local conditions. For example, we did make some changes, for example, wind design that is there, because the wind design was, based on parameters that didn't, but we had some studies that they used in there. So we do make changes if necessary to the National Building Code, but that's the state, the state the Building Codes Division is responsible for that.
Okay, so are the city's codes consistent with the state, and are they consistent with the national?
Yes, so the state,
current code.
So the state adopts a code which is to be used throughout the state. The cities can adopt their own local conditions. So like our Title 2485 adopts has its own regulations on that. But as far as the force levels we use what is there in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code.
So can the city make the requirements greater or lesser? Do you have that discretion to make them more stringent or less stringent than what the state has done?
As far as seismic, yes, the state has delegated that authority to the local jurisdictions to adopt whatever regulations they need for seismic retrofits.
But we can only make them higher, right?
No.
Can we make them lower too?
Yeah.
Okay, either way.
Yeah, I mean, they basically said you can adopt your own regulations on that.
All right, so this isn't a statement of fault, it's a statement of reality. We're about 40 minutes behind on our issue. So we're going to take our 4 o'clock break now for 7 minutes and 12 seconds. And amongst the work group members, obviously this is a voluntary, not mandatory exercise, is if you can, during the break, talk to someone on the work group that you know the least well. Get to know them, instead of talking to people you know well, let's do some cross-fertilization of friendship and knowledge, and we'll be back in, when I start to show you. On your mark and set, go. 5 minutes, 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Great. Oh, yeah, that's working. That's good? Yeah.
Get your slide deck going.
that work? Yes, all right. Great. Hi. I think I met most of you. My name is Jana Papefthimiou, and I work at the Bureau of Emergency Management, where I do planning, policy, and community programs. And I've been working on the URM project for some time, actually under 3 different directors and 5 different commissioners in charge. So it's been a long project, and we've seen a lot of change. And I want to give an overview now of kind of how this project got started back in 2014 and kind of bring us up to the point where we've been here. As Amit's presentation highlighted, there's lots of questions or commentary about the aspects of the project, and I'm grateful for Amit because part of what I'm going to talk about touches again on the inventory, and I know that's controversial. I just want to, I guess, say that my intention in presenting this is to be as open-handed as possible and just kind of saying what our thinking was at the time and how we got to this point, and it's intended to give us kind of a shared understanding of how we got where we are now. But it's not intended to advance one position, and I see folks in this room that I know have been with us for a long time, and so I will welcome your adding to to the story I'm about to tell, and maybe together we can get the whole story. I will ask you we can take questions or comments as we go along. I will just ask Sam to help me keep track of that so that I don't get mixed up in that, and as soon as I'm done, we'll eat. So that's my only comment on lots of questions. But
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm intrigued with the first sentence.
Mm-hmm.
The most important word is usually.
Mm-hmm.
And although I wouldn't disagree with that, if all we're talking about is something that's usual, what about the rest of the spectrum of buildings?
That's a question. Let me start, and I'll explain the context for this slide, okay?
Well, but I guess my point is, if we're dealing with seismic safety, which is what I think we are and should be, despite what the name of the group is, then we ought to be looking at the other building types in order to be thorough about seismic safety.
So I know you couldn't come at the beginning, so I covered a little bit of this about people's thoughts in the community and the work about expanding the scope to include soft story and other types of buildings. So we're going to discuss that at the end of this meeting, setting it up to change the scope to include those other issues.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks. And this is just to explain, not to say that we have to continue on that path, but given everything Amit just told us about that the city's had a committee in '96 and we updated the building code and we have a building code now, and some have said if we enforce it consistently, wouldn't that get us most of the way there? Why are we talking again about URM buildings? When we started this project in 2014, we were influenced by what was then, and in most places still is, kind of best professional judgment about seismic safety as described by the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, which is a federal program that looks to reduce earthquake hazards all across the country, and it's strongly aligned with FEMA, which is the agency that my Bureau, Emergency Management, works a lot. They publish this guide that they give away for free, so you all got a copy. And that guide says that usually when a city or jurisdiction is looking to increase their seismic safety, the first thing they look to is unreinforced masonry buildings because those have a great risk. That's not the only way to start, and we may choose a different path, but that was our thinking in 2014 when we embarked on this work. Then, and again, disregarding the specific number or the status of any particular building, so we influenced by that thinking that unreinforced masonry buildings are a place to start if you want to make people safer in an earthquake. We said, how much of an issue is that in Portland? How many, is it bigger than a bread box? Is it smaller than a Volkswagen? And what we said is about 9% of all our buildings, we think, are unreinforced masonry buildings. So 9%, that's not 54%, but it's a relatively significant percentage of all our buildings. And that we believe they include about 7,200 households.
You got condos.
Oh, sorry. No, we didn't.
I understand the national standard.
A quick time out, just for ease. What I want you to do is put your name tag up, and that way I'll call on you at a break as opposed to mid-sentence or mid-word. I'm going to
Thanks, Sam.
Well, I understand the national standards about unreinforced masonry, but I don't know too many other cities that have had a dramatic increase in the loads of buildings other than Portland. And so I think what happens in Dubuque may be very different than what happens in Portland. So I think the national standards may not necessarily apply to seismic safety here.
So, thank you for that. So given the time and talk about the ground rules I mentioned earlier, we're going to only ask questions for clarification during her chief presentation, and then questions like that or other people have questions to get into more of a discussion or making points. And I do, I maybe want to suggest I overrule you about, go ahead and.
I defer to you.
Give her a chance to do some uninterrupted presentation to get in the swing of things. It's as hard as a presenter in a big group to every third slide or every two slides. So give her a chance to roll a little bit, and then we'll come back. So do you have a question for clarification?
This is clarification. You say that the process started off at 2014. I got the impression that the process started much before that.
Thank you. So we had this committee in 1996 or 93 that led to code changes by 1996. I'm talking about the committee that was a precursor to this committee and sort of our revisiting of the earthquake regs after they had been in place for close to 20 years. We came back to them because this thing I just told you about, the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, in a sense that there were quite a few URM buildings in Portland, including a lot of residences, and including, we think, about 1,800 housing units that are in subsidized, affordable public housing. So people that don't have a lot of choice about where to live. The average age of a building in URM is about, a URM in Portland is about 90 years. We haven't built any in Portland since 1960, so they're all getting older every year. When I first gave this presentation, it was 87. Many of them are, given that age, it's unsurprising probably that many of them are historic. They're either landmarks, they're in a local historic district, or they're contributing in a national historic district. And probably the good news, more than half of them are single story. So they're not tall URM buildings, but they're a lot of one-story buildings. This is a map of about where we think they are. The red show what we believe to be URM buildings, not to pick on any particular building, but this gives a sense, I think, of where they would be distributed around the city. They're on main thoroughfares that were important streets in the city from, before 1960, downtown, St. John, Selwood. These are neighborhoods that have relatively high concentrations of them. We know these, again, percentages, we don't get stuck on the numbers given all the discussion we've already had about the inventory, but we think about 6% of URMs in Portland have been fully retrofitted, so they're up to the current building codes. About 11% have been partially retrofitted. Those are folks who have mostly braced the parapets during re-roofing. About 3% of them are in progress, so we are making progress, and as we see more redevelopment and just how building prices rising in Portland, that probably accelerates. And about 80% of them, nothing's happening. So as far as we know, they're still at seismic risk. With all that as background, in 2014, the council charged city staff with setting out a process to develop policies that would reduce Portlanders' risk from unreinforced masonry buildings. And the process that laid out, that I'll talk a little more about, is they gave a charge to city staff to put together a series of committees. First, a retrofit standards committee that was made up of architects, engineers, geologists. They were all people who worked professionally in the design and retrofit of buildings. They passed their recommendations to a support committee that was made up entirely of people who worked in finance, and they were money people. So people who owned and developed buildings or who worked for banks and who kind of understood how big projects get financed. And then they passed those recommendations forward to a policy committee that was intended to be like a conference committee that would pull together the recommended standards, the recommended financial supports, and bring something forward that would be sort of a package of recommendations to staff. And then staff was to bring those back to the city council. We optimistically thought this project would take a year. The Retrofit Standards Committee, actually, they worked through theirs in about 6 months. So they were architects and engineers. They said that they looked at case studies from other cities, mostly in California, which some of them do have mandatory URM retrofits. And they also looked in other parts of the world, like New Zealand, that have earthquakes and unreinforced masonry buildings. They recommend that the retrofit should be mandatory. They put the buildings into 5 risk categories, and they set different standards for each type of building depending on the risk. They said the timelines for retrofit should be between 10 and 25 years. And they also recommended strengthening our existing code, so as buildings are remodeled or re-roofed, that we see more retrofits that way. So this is sort of necessary to understand, in the simplest terms, to sort of understand their recommendations. This is how I understand it. So you can retrofit a building to meet a performance standard, like you put more money and more work into the building, and then you get performance after an earthquake. The sort of simplest or lowest standard is collapse prevention. If a building's retrofitted to collapse prevention, we believe it will not pancake during an earthquake. So you have a good chance of safely exiting the building. The expectation that you could ever go back in that building is pretty much 0. That building is going to be a demo, but our hope is that no lives will be lost, and that's our highest goal, is to protect lives. And so that's collapse prevention. Life safety is a bit higher standard. It's still not guaranteed that this building would be able to be rehabilitated after an earthquake, but life safety is something closer to what a modern building is, that it's safer, and then we'll see where we're at after the earthquake. Immediate occupancy would be something like a building that we expect to, it may still need to go out of the building and come back in, but this is a building like the building that I work in, which is the Emergency Coordination Center, right? So we know we're going to need to use that building after the earthquake pretty quickly, and so it's built to a higher seismic standards. It's greater cost, greater benefit. And then operational is a building that you can stay inside that building and keep working all the way through the earthquake. This is what you want like a surgical ward in a hospital to be at, right? No interruption, just keep going all the way through. That's a very high cost. But for some structures, it's a pump station for the Water Bureau that needs to keep working to prevent a flood. It's got to keep going. So those are standards. This is what the first committee recommended. They said that immediate occupancy, not the most high standard, not the surgery ward, but immediate occupancy, we should look at critical buildings, of which we think there are only 5 or 6 critical buildings in Portland that are URMs. But there's a fire station, ambulance headquarters, there's a couple pump stations that belong to the Water Bureau that are pretty important for the whole functioning of the water system. So we said immediate occupancy. Then damage control, schools, community centers, and other high occupancy structures, buildings that could have a lot of people inside and we want to keep them safe. This is to what Amit was talking about those Class A assembly spaces, like a theater, that we know hundreds of lives could be inside. Life safety, they recommended life safety buildings for relatively bigger URM buildings. So if it's like a 100-unit apartment building, it's got 300 people inside it, it's more than 4 stories tall, so it's like dangerous to if it tipped over blocks away, could spread, then they said this life safety standard. Then collapse prevention, those 1 and 2 story, like it's a garage, it's a storage building, they said just let it not pancake. And then everything else they put in this simplified life safety, which is not a standard we're going towards anymore, so I don't want to spend a ton of time explaining it. But basically it was trying to get us towards life safety, but it was like the econo way to achieve that, I'll say. It was the econo option. So those are the recommendations that they passed to the Finance Committee. The first thing the Finance Committee did, smartly, because they were money people, said, how much is this going to cost? And then they spent like 90% of their time trying to figure that out, and it turned out to be a super hard question, right? They looked at some federal studies that averaged together, like URM retrofits across the whole country, and they came up with a number. They looked at some case studies from Portland that they thought were relevant, and that came up with a number. But basically what they found was even though the average of the federal studies more or less lined up with the case studies that they saw in Portland, the range was huge, right? So like the average cost is whatever, I don't want to make up a number, but say it's $50 a square foot, but then the range of cost could be between $20 a square foot and like $300 a square foot. So for any particular building owner, it was not super reassuring to see how wide the range was. I don't want to get into the actual numbers they came up with then because we've done more case studies since then. Other studies have come out, and I think that's a whole important topic that we may get to later. But I just want to say they did try and figure out how much it cost, and they struggled with that. And actually, Shelley worked on it, and I'm sure she'll be glad to share the trials and trepidations of trying to get data to answer that question. But they came up with some numbers that they were going to work with, and then they made a list of what financial and policy supports could accomplish those retrofits. So they came up with, I always kind of tease about this, they came up with a lot of ways to give away the money. We could, and I'll show you a list of them. They didn't come up with a lot of places to find the money to give away, right? Which is always a problem. But in terms of what their ideas were, because I think we may come back to some of these, and so I kind of know groundwork has been done. These are all things that we could dig into more and explore. A loan program, like a straight up, like a revolving loan program from the city, or that we could work with private capital to encourage them to loan more to URM building owners. We said a credit enhancement that would make them make it easier for them to borrow from commercial banks. An interest rate buy down to make their payments lower the first few years to make that possible for them. Grants. Some people are not going to ever be able to take out a loan. They need free money. Or a rebate. Maybe we don't give them the money up front, but if they do the work, we promise to give them some or all of the money back. A property tax exemption or an abatement. This works for profits, obviously, that pay taxes. How about a state tax credit? It sort of costs us as a local jurisdiction less, but it provides a benefit, and the other jurisdictions in Oregon could use it. Or maybe accelerated depreciation, which I'm sure there's some people here who can explain that better for me, but it can give you tax benefits in a federal program.
These are just, sorry.
Yeah.
These are just wishful thinking.
Well,
there's no, at that point of time, this is just a list of things to consider.
We could do, a list of things to, yes. I'll accept that. It was well thought out. They were smart guys and ladies. They wrote a report. They did research. They showed examples of where it had worked elsewhere. But their job wasn't to come up with the cash, right? It was to say, here's what you could do if you had the money. And they had good ideas, I hope. They also said, here's some stuff you can do that doesn't cost you so much. They said, transfer development rights. You have a 2-story building that's a lot that's zoned for 10 stories. Why don't you sell those air rights for those other 8 stories? There's money that could pay for a retrofit, right? Or expedited permitting. Time is money. What if you jump to the front of the line at BDS? I know that never happens, sorry, BDS. But what if you could, right? That would save you something. Or, now folks who do development know you come in to do a project and then you might hear, you need a green roof, you need bicycle parking, you need ADA, you need other improvements. They said, let's exempt people from those other improvements to keep project costs down. If we're going to have some incentives, let's give them to the people who come in first. So we can, if retrofits are already happening, let's try and make them happen faster. Let's promise people that if they do this, they can build their building back afterwards. That might be important for some people. And let's, as much as we can, standardize the retrofit methods, because a lot of cost goes into the design and permitting, right? What if we had some pre-approved designs that you knew could just walk up to the permitting counter and get them? It turns out that's hard because the buildings are so different. But the idea was the more we can standardize it, we're going to make it easier for people to get through. And then finally, sometimes it's just still hard to do. I work for the city. I know I even find this to be true myself. Sometimes it's hard to work with the city. What if you had a concierge that could kind of help you walk all the way through the process and get the permit in your hand, get the loan, get it going? That would be awesome. So that was their recommendations. They gave those to the policy committee. The policy committee included some people from some of the money people from the earlier committee. It included some of the architects and engineers from the other committee. And it also had some more folks on the committee like Portland Public Schools. They own a bunch of URMs. More broad stakeholders, I guess, all the people that would probably care about this. Their intention was to build on the work of earlier committees, and they also did more community outreach. I said they did community outreach. Actually, it was mostly me and staff people, but a lot of times we were graciously joined by people on the committee. Walt, who's again joining us, came with me to a bunch of those presentations. Thanks. And we also did some public open house events. So the committee came and just didn't give a presentation, but listened, and the public came and spoke to them. They also want to do a cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is always super hard, right? Because you come back to the question of how much does a retrofit cost, which we struggled to agree on. And then you also come back to a lot of other really hard, some of kind of deep moral questions, like how much is a life worth? Or how much is injury worth, right? And you have to make those assumptions to do a cost-benefit analysis that's evaluating projects that might save lives. So they commissioned one, and I don't want to get stuck on the outcome, but just to tell you that this was their thinking. They were trying to figure out, is this worth doing? And the evidence they saw was like, yeah, this is probably worth doing. The cost benefit pencils out. You get more benefit than you're paying. And what's the biggest benefit? It's life saved. It's not the protection of the property. It's just that people aren't harmed. They came up with new standards, so they supported mandatory retrofits, sort of, mostly, but different to what the earlier committees had come up. They simplified the standards a lot. So remember that before there were 5 categories, now there's just 4. Immediate occupancy stayed the same. For that one fire station, that one ambulance house, yes, there was always agreement. Damage control. This was still the same standard. So for schools, for community centers, for those high occupancy structures, they still said, yeah, we've got to retrofit those so that we can come back to those in recovery and use them. But then for the ones, those little storage buildings, those bottom of the list buildings before, they said just brace the parapet so they don't fall off and whack people. We're good with that. We don't need to get even all the way to collapse prevention. And likewise, for all the other buildings that are not schools or community centers or public safety, they said, let's do collapse risk reduction. So they didn't take any of the standard published retrofits that like the American Society of Civil Engineers or the building code says to do. Instead, they gave a clear path of like tie the roof to the walls, tie the walls, brace the parapets, and we'll call it good, and you don't have to do other improvements, even though a structural engineer might say, well, that would be good to do. They were trying to simplify it. So they invented their own standard, basically, and that was their recommendation to council. So these are the recommendation council. The standards mandatory retrofits that I just highlighted, with pretty high standards for what turned out to be mostly public buildings, so not all city buildings, but school buildings and utility buildings, high. Strengthening those triggers to promote more retrofits during remodeling and re-roofing. And the main thing they suggested changing was, Amit talked about this, they look at your costs over a 2-year period, and that's how they decide if you have to do the retrofit or not. They said, let's stretch that out to 5 years. So people can't like do some stuff this year and then wait a while and do some more stuff. Let's make that harder. We'll accelerate some retrofits that way. So that was a recommendation. They were keen on the tax exemption. Again, that costs us less, right? Public education, they supported, and they also said we really have to help owners. By this time they had heard from a lot of owners that like this is really hard, we're not getting enough information. They knew people were frustrated, and so that was an important recommendation of theirs also, that we had to give more support to owners. As a result, a council resolution came out in 2018. You will note, if you look at the report and then look at this, that the URM Policy Committee made recommendations in December of 2017, and this didn't come to council, they didn't vote on it until June of 2018, so there was 6 months in there. And what happened in that time, candidly, was that staff got the recommendations from the Policy Committee, we brought them to City Hall, and we got feedback that like this is not quite going to pass. We don't sense there's political support for this. This needs more work. And so over that 6 months, staff developed recommendations in addition to, and in some places different to, what the policy committee gave them.
Why is that a policy? How can a city, which forms a committee to make recommendations, and is completely disregarded by the city to do their own stuff, then why have a committee? Why are we here?
Good question. Well, we're in a different place now, but I'm jumping. Okay, whoop, there it is. So the deal was last time, and this is why we're paying attention to the charter at the beginning, right? And what are the ground rules, which I would say was, we talked about this at our first meeting, was a shortcoming of our previous process, that we did not have these very clearly described ground rules. But the process we laid out last time, and I think we were honest about this, was that the city staff picked the committee. We didn't have open applications. I didn't pick them either, so I don't feel bad saying that. I think they tried to pick people that were smart and they thought would do good work and cared about the community, but nobody got to apply for that committee. You got asked to be on it, right? And so generally when you have a committee like that that's picked by staff, they're only advising staff, right? Because if you're advising the city council would pick them. They would get appointed. These people were picked by staff to advise staff, and it was always the intention that the recommendations would come back to staff and then from there go to city council. And staff could pick and choose. I also agree that I think that that was also going to be a 1-year process, and it was going to be kind of quick, and we thought we were going to, after 4 years of working on this, people were pretty invested in this process, right? And all the meetings and the public open houses. So I think that we followed the rules we laid out in one sense, but another way, yeah, you're totally right. People felt tricked by that. They did not feel like that was fair, and they wanted council to take us up or down vote on what the committee told them to do, and council didn't do that. What they voted on was this, which is kind of a stuck together recommendations of stuff that came from city staff and stuff that came from the committee. The first recommendation was mandatory retrofits of schools, community centers, and critical buildings. That was something that had unanimously been recommended all the way along, right? The architects and engineers thought so, the money people thought so, city staff thought so, and council voted that we should do it. Where are we at with it now? It's not started. So we'll talk some more. I'm sure that hopefully that'll generate a question, but yes. But where is that yet? It was a direction from council, but it's not started. So that was one, I mean, and part of it because we're having another committee, right? So that has been taking up time, but that's one. They also directed that the city would require roof ties and parapet bracing for all buildings over a 20-year timeline, but there would be like no more like wait until you replace your roof. It was like you got 20 years. In that 20 years, everyone has to brace their parapet so it won't fall off. That's another direction that came from council that hasn't started. They also directed staff to strengthen the triggers for re-roofing and remodeling. That 2-year, 5-year, how many dollars per square foot thing we talked about. They said tighten that up, get more retrofits that way. And council did adopt that. They adopted that at the same time that they adopted placarding and tenant notification. They all came together in one council resolution. And then, as you will note, placarding and tenant notification, that was the thing the committee was like, what the hey? That was not our recommendation, that was the staff recommendation. And council passed it, but it did not, we got a legal challenge and we got knocked down in court. And we decided to repeal it rather than continue to appeal that legal action. When we repealed it, because of the way that it was passed, where it was all bundled together, tenant notification, placarding, and the stronger triggers, and the legal challenge was to the whole thing as a package. When we repealed it, we had to repeal all of it. So we had to take out the different triggers as well. So those were implemented, then repealed. And then we were directed to make a new policy committee, which is one thing we've definitely accomplished because we are all here having another committee.
I have a clarification.
Yes.
So the last two have been repealed, the first two have not. So the first two are still in effect?
The first two, the mandatory retrofits of schools, community centers, and critical buildings, and the require roof ties and parapet bracing for all buildings. Those I'm glad you asked, because that is kind of a weird one, right? So the changes to the code happen in 2 steps, and that's often the case, right? Because what happens is we come to council and we say, we think we should make schools retrofit. What do you think, yes or no? And council said, yes, make schools do the retrofits. Then we go back and we write the legal language for the building code, and we take that to the building codes division and they approve it, and we take it to the Development Review Advisory Commission and they review it. And it's the very specific like standards, thou shalt do it in this time to this standard. And then we come back to council and say, okay, here we did what you said, we wrote that we revised the building code, and then they adopt a new building code. Only the first step has happened. So council's directed the Bureau of Development Services to modify the building code to require retrofits of schools, but BDS has not yet taken the next step of coming back to council with a modified building code to be adopted. So it's the intent of council, but it is not the law. And for the council that directed us to do that is a pretty different city council than the council that we have now.
Probably going to be very different.
And it may, and if we can count on one thing, it is that it will continue to change, right?
Really politically.
Totally true. Yes. All right. So there was more. Yes, there was a very long resolution. They also directed us to work on a property tax exemption. This is another one that's kind of like 2-3-step process. So we did the first part of this. In order to do a property tax exemption, property taxes are collected by the state, so we have to get the state's permission. And I, and again, others, several people in this room, awesomely, went to Salem and lobbied on behalf of permission to do a property tax exemption program. That was Senate Bill 311, and it passed in 2018. Do I have that right? No, 2016. Whoa, that was a long time ago. It passed in 2016. And it said that local jurisdictions could adopt a property tax exemption that would permit people to offset the cost of a seismic retrofit by not paying property taxes. They wouldn't owe them for up to like 10 years in order to offset the cost. So that's legal in the state of Oregon now. Any jurisdiction could do that. Portland could do it, or Salem could do it, wherever. But in order to implement it, the city is not the only jurisdiction that collects property taxes in Portland, right? We only get about 1/3 of the property taxes that are collected in Portland. And then we have to share about another 1/3 with Multnomah County and another 1/3 with Portland Public Schools. And so in order to implement this property tax exemption, we have to agree to forego the revenue from those buildings, but so does the school district, and so does Multnomah County. And so that, I would say, is probably the primary reason that we have not advanced on this, is because we, not me, I do a lot of things, but not that. The city has not negotiated with Multnomah County and Portland Public Schools and reached an agreement about how much taxes they're willing to give up to achieve this public benefit. And so it's not been implemented. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm wondering how the negotiations are going. This is a leading question because in your own notes, it says negotiations are not going well. Tax credits are really unpopular. The county is saying they're not an economic development entity. They
Can I just, you're talking about my notes, so I'm wondering what the date on them is or whatever.
Yeah. Good call. This is from a little over a year ago, August 2018.
Yeah.
The URM kickoff committee, when the county is saying they're not an economic development entity, they're facing a $7 to $9 million budget gap, and that
Totally, and I think, I don't have well, here's what, I don't want to get too much inside baseball, but basically, our property tax exemption for seismic is based on another property tax exemption for brownfields, which was another thing that we thought would be great if we could give people a property tax exemption to clean up their brownfield and put it back to economic use. And Portland wanted to implement that, and we went to Multnomah County and said, hey, let's work together and do this program so we can see more of these brownfields be, creating employment. And Multnomah County wasn't interested in it. And they said, we're not an economic development agency, so no offense, they should get cleaned up, but we're not giving up money to advance that purpose. That's not our purpose. My thought on the one hand is but they do care about, they have the Department of Health and Human Services, and they do care about they have the health department, they care about people's health and well-being. So maybe they'd be more open to URM retrofits than they are to brownfields. But at the other hand, it still costs money, and that is a foundational issue also.
Yeah, and I want to point out one more piece about SB 311, which is really frustrating to me personally, is the inequity of it. Whereas my building on Northwest 23rd, my building, which has X number of square foot, I would get probably 4 or 5 or maybe 6 times more of a tax abatement than, say, a building on Decum and MLK would get for the same amount of retrofits. So it's just so.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think there's a whole other big conversation about inequities in our property tax system in general, probably. I agree. I think we never thought this was going to be the whole answer, because some people that pay a lot of taxes get a lot of benefit, and other people, the retrofit costs us just as much, and they're like, I pay $600 a year in property taxes. What am I going to do with that?
Clarification. So when you bundle the various taxing jurisdictions together, they collectively said no. Does the city have the ability to just exempt the city portion, maybe for a longer period of time? I'm just looking for different ways.
We don't, because not that we could go back to legislature and try and change it, but right now what we can do is it requires the approval of the recipients of 75% of the tax receipts for the jurisdiction to sign off. So since we only get a third of the tax receipts, our sign off isn't enough. The state tax assessor wouldn't let us do it on our own. But so there's something there. Maybe it's a good idea, not by itself. But this is one we should be working on. But we again haven't gotten far.
Clarify the implementation. When you say it's not started, it has started, and it has not been approved. Is that correct?
Well,
but I think we should not say not started, which implies that it can pass. And at this point of time, there is no such hope at all, because the schools have said no, the county has said no, okay? And if that's the situation, just say,
no go.
If we started and it's a no-go. I mean, I don't want the committee to think that is an option.
Well, and this is the thing, keep hope alive, right, Vic? I'm not sure, because this is me, I don't know, well, okay. That might be true. I don't want to say it's not, but what I'm saying is this is me making inquiries within the city, calling the Office of Government Relations. Have you worked on this? No, we haven't. Why not? Well, we don't know if it would work or not. Okay, well, did you ask Multnomah County? Well, we asked them about brownfields, and they don't want to work with us on that, so it seems like it doesn't work. I'm not sure, but I think that maybe what I would say is if this was a high priority for the city politically, and we want to put our force behind it, we could initiate a negotiation and see where it goes. We haven't pushed very hard on it, so I don't know if we've not started or we just kind of gave up without starting. I don't know how to say that.
I just want the committee to know that this is not an option because it has been tried and people have said no. So we should not make a decision, all of us, based upon a fact which is not correct. I'm sorry.
Okay, so, thank you. One of the topics I'm bringing up at the end of this meeting is to what extent, if any, you all want a more robust discussion on all of these financial options, so we have enough time to do it full. I think it goes without saying, it bears repeating, there is no money currently available from property tax exemptions for the reasons you stated. The chances of getting them are the same as Catherine Zeta-Jones leaving Michael Douglas for me. Now, that's an effort to be funny. So is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? I don't know. But I'm just trying to break the tension, get questions for clarification, so I can get you fed, and we will have a full meal deal presentation on these topics when we can. Abe.
I asked my question, my card down.
Okay, thank you. Jonna.
Or does, sorry, I think Dave's still waiting. He's so patient, it's confusing.
Has anyone actually run the numbers to see how much money Portland Public Schools is going to miss out on? Because it's not 9% of the total building population, right?
Right. So another thing, I didn't want to, again, if we were interested in exploring this, we could spend more time on SB 311, but another part of that law says that jurisdictions have to cap the amount that they're going to give away. Because if they just said, we're going to give the exemption to everyone who applies, then they don't know how much they're going to lose, right? And that the state doesn't want to, they want to protect jurisdictions from having that blank check. And so we could, that would be something that's up for negotiation with PPS and Multnomah County, is to say, we're going to allocate whatever, $10 million, $50 million, $100 million of property tax exemption for this purpose, and therefore we can anticipate the maximum amount of money that PPS would lose out on is whatever, 33% of that. We even at one time discussed, like, well, could the city or the city and the county find a way to make PPS whole? So they take a property tax exemption, but then we give them money to pay them back, so they really don't lose money, only we lose money, but then it's costing us twice as much, so then it'll seem like, where are we gonna get that from? But there could be, creative ways to cap the cost for PPS in particular, or to try and make them whole in some other way.
So it's still a possibility then? More so
yes.
than Catherine
And
Zeta.
more than Catherine, and I have to say, PPS was relatively more open to this in our discussions with them, with Multnomah County, and I think that has also something to do with the politics between the city and the county, whatever they were arguing about in 2018.
Anthony's next.
Going back to the 2015 slides, what exactly did you mean when you were talking about a post-earthquake right to rebuild?
Oh, great. Okay, so right now, if you have a building that was a beautiful historic building that was built 100 years ago, it probably doesn't comply with very many building codes at all, right? Like, you have a store in a residential district, and it's different. The rooms are too small, and it's not ADA. It's like got a lot of things because building codes have changed a lot, right? And so if your building was very badly damaged in an earthquake or it had to be demolished, you couldn't necessarily put that building back there, right? You couldn't get the permits to rebuild it. So one idea they came up with, they said, what if we promise someone, if they invest in this historic building, that we promise they can build it back after an earthquake? Otherwise, it's going to be gone forever. And that might be sort of something that doesn't cost the city anything right now, but might have value to some property owners and would encourage them to want to do this. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Just a quick clarification for David. SB 311 won't cover condos, just so you know, as well.
Really?
Yeah, because SB 311 is for multifamily or commercial or industrial, and condos are not considered multifamily according
They're
to this.
considered commercial though, aren't they?
They are. I wrote it mostly with the city attorney, so I'm confident it covers condos. But again, let's come back to this because I think we could. It's like we could spend a lot of time on it. And it's interesting, but I don't think I want to kind of get the whole picture before we zoom in.
It's more than interesting.
Seismic Retrofit Revolving Loan Fund. The city could find a wad of cash and we could loan it out to somebody, and then they would pay us back and we could loan it to somebody else. So this was a recommendation of the committee to explore that. We've talked about it in very big ways, but the city has not really made an effort yet to accumulate the cash that we would loan out, or worked out the details of who would run that program or really how it would work. the staff program to assist URM owners to help people get through the permitting process, or get through design, get loans. I think that could have a lot of value. That hasn't started. To me, that one's pretty understandable because this committee was still going to meet and say, well, what are they trying to, staff's going to help them do what? You know, we need to figure that out. Legislative agenda, they asked us to work on a seismic retrofit tax credit that would come from the state, and historic tax credit that would come from the state. And also a grant program for not-for-profits, recognizing that even if we got that property tax exemption going, that it would not help not-for-profits at all, because if you don't pay taxes, the tax exemption doesn't help you. So we lobbied, I and others here lobbied on behalf of those in 2019. They got a hearing, they didn't get out of committee, so those got stuck. We could come back to them, but they so far haven't gone very far. Assess city-owned URM buildings. This is one that we were also directed to do, to look at what we own. It's started, but it's not complete. I think a big barrier for the city in accomplishing this has been different bureaus own the buildings, are responsible for the buildings. A lot of our URMs belong to Parks. Parks, as if you've seen the paper, has a lot of financial woes right now. Yes, and so for them, figuring out how much it would cost to retrofit the building, even that study has cost. And their feeling was like, why would we spend money to figure out how much money we need to spend when we don't have money? Like that didn't make sense for them, so they took a pass on spending a lot of resources on that. And then a financial plan to retrofit URM buildings. The city does not have a plan for all of its unreinforced masonry buildings to retrofit them. And I think we've also gotten a little bit chicken and egg on this one, because when I reach out sometimes to facilities managers and say, hey, do you have a plan to retrofit your own building? They said, yeah, I heard the city was going to raise the standards for my building. I want to see what they are before I figure out, so I can figure out how much it's going to cost so I can do it. So Parks would also say, like for a community center, like they know that they want to retrofit. They say, well, I want to see what the standard is, and then I'll figure out how I'm going to pay for it. But we haven't updated the standards like we said we were going to do, so we kind of got in a loop there. Yeah. Yes.
So let's try to be transparent. It's 5:30. I can smell the food from here. You don't get this body by not eating. Let's take a few questions and points, recognizing that we're going to have big, huge conversations about in-depth conversations about all this stuff. This presentation we're for is designed just to give those people who are kind of new to this process a general idea. The risk of giving general presentations there are nuances that are very, very important. They get lost, and therefore there's a sense that you're only hearing one side of the story. I'm very aware of that phenomenon. I'm just trying to manage this in a way to build on this. This isn't the last opportunity to waterboard John.
Every meeting, I'm here for you.
So let's do a few crucial ones, and then I'll announce the instructions for food. Vic, I think you're up. Oh, your card.
Oh, okay, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Kidla, you're up.
No, sorry, that was
You're
my
not
question.
God, did I dissuade questions?
You mentioned food.
I think that dissuaded questions.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do to try to pick up some time. We believe there's food for everyone, he says to the audience. Okay? What I've asked, just because it's a working dinner, if you please let the work group members go first.
Racism were policies which explicitly discriminated against a particular group, whereas implicitly racist policies were ones that were perhaps not intentionally discriminatory. However, the outcomes were. So just to kind of frame that, we're also going to use a fair housing lens when we're talking about this. So just to, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Fair Housing Act has the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which states that cities, the recipients, must take actions to address segregation and related barriers for groups with characteristics protected by the Act, so protected classes, as often reflected in racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So that means that it's not enough for cities to just say, well, we weren't discriminating. They have to affirmatively further fair housing policies. So that's just some frameworks that we're working with. these are the key points in the history that we're going to be talking about. We're only going back 100 years. We are not going to be addressing the issues that go back to the native populations in this area. We are not even going to be talking about just the original settlement of the state. Obviously, those are extensive histories of their own. But we're really talking about formal zoning policies that go back about 100 years. And there are three kind of main eras that we're talking about. Early zoning from 1900 to 1930, about the next expansion of single-family zoning time from the 30s to about the 80s, and then contemporary planning, which is about 1980s to the 2000s, and Tom will cover that period of time. So for the early zoning sections, zoning began, for those of you who aren't aware, it really began with the kind of guise of public health to protect people from noxious uses, separate land uses for safety reasons. Overcrowding was often cited, but this often kind of bled over into, who defined what a noxious use was. Early in the 1900s, some cities started using zoning to segregate their cities by legislating separate areas for black and white households. Ordinances that enforced this kind of segregation were overturned by a 1917 Supreme Court case, Buchanan versus Worley. But many cities still found ways to work around that decision and continued to segregate using other zoning tactics. And further, that Supreme Court decision did not apply to private real estate covenants, which began to really flourish after that time. So this is an example of a racially restrictive covenant that you would have found. This is one that was in Laurelhurst from 1913. And you can see very clearly how it states, not just specifically the people that were not to be in these neighborhoods, but other uses that were not allowed in this particular property. So it says, nor shall the same or any part thereof be in any manner used or occupied by Chinese, Japanese, or Negroes, except that persons of said races may be employed as servants by residents. And then further on it goes and says, nor shall any building or any part thereof on said premises be erected, maintained, or used for flats, apartments, stables, stores, or business or manufacturing purposes. So this is, pretty blatantly an example of explicit racist kind of restrictive zoning built into these covenants.
Can
And
I
yes,
quick clarification on that?
Sure.
That example or other ones like it, those were just private ones?
Yes.
Like homeowners associations, which they didn't have back then, but we do now, or
Right.
some group like that.
So like when a development was platted or the developer, kind of
deed restrictions.
Deed restrictions,
Got
exactly.
it. Okay, thank you.
So this type of discrimination in covenants was declared unenforceable in 1948 by the Supreme Court. And then still further, people continued to find, especially within the real estate industry, there were ways that were found to work around even that restriction. So now we can talk about the concentration of black households and how it came to be in Albina. And I know many people are familiar with this history, but it always helps to be reminded that from the start, places where African Americans could live in Portland were very limited. In 1919, rules were added to the Real Estate Industry Code of Ethics in Portland that prohibited the selling or giving loans to blacks or Asians for the purpose of purchasing homes in white neighborhoods. And that rule was not removed from the Code of Ethics until 1956. At the turn of the century, Lower Albina was a neighborhood open to black residents, and it was older, less expensive, and became one of the only places that blacks could buy homes in Portland. And by the late 1930s, more than half the city's nearly 2,000 black residents lived in Lower Albina. Then, during World War II, jobs in the shipyards brought many more black families to Portland, and many found housing in Vanport, a public housing project for shipyard workers and other residents that was never really intended to be a permanent settlement. So, but still, nevertheless, people remained there after. Yes?
Did the Orientals, the Asians, congregate in with Lower Albina as well?
Well, they were also restricted out of lots of other neighborhoods, so
Yeah,
you'll find that
I realize that, sure.
Yes, so there are parts of this, presentation that will get at other descriptions of neighborhoods where it was places where people were also of other communities of color, sometimes Southern European communities, Eastern Europeans, people who were considered not, desirable, Northern European white extraction. So in 1948, there was the Vanport flood that washed away basically the entire community, and the black population had basically nowhere else to go but the Lower Albina area if they wanted to purchase homes, or basically. So by the end of the 1950s, there were 23,000 fewer white residents and 7,000 more black residents than there had been at the beginning of that decade. So we're talking about a massive amount of population shift that concentrated the black population into Albina. So then this is a map showing the earliest zoning code in Portland, 1924, and the areas in yellow are the areas that were zoned single family. If you're familiar with current single family zoning in Portland, you'll note that this is a lot less. It only had 2 residential zones. It had single family and multifamily, and only the 15, quote, highest quality neighborhoods were zoned single family. And those were created at the request of the property owners in the area. The predominance of Zone 2, so multifamily, was due to 1912 Greater Portland Plan's expectation that Portland's population was going to reach 2 million by 1940, which was a far cry from what happened, actually. So many people have seen this map also. This is a 1937 redlining and greenlining map. After the Depression, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps that used neighborhood ratings of desirability to determine whether banks should make loans and in what terms in those areas. They assess neighborhoods' desirability by assigning colors on a map. And as you can see here, the green areas were the best. The blue was still desirable. Yellow was definitely declining, and red was hazardous. So you can see where people could get loans and what the likelihood of the being able to find a house if you were confined to the red areas. The Federal Housing Administration discriminated against those living in multifamily zones pretty blatantly. As you can see, the ones that are outlined are where the single family zone areas were. Neighborhoods were redlined even if housing was in good shape, but if the percentage of people of color in the area was high. And the map shows Portland's redlining map with the original, so those are the original single family zones. So these are copies of original assessor's notes that make the racial bias of the system very clear. The one on top is one from Lower Albina that was redlined and given a grade of D-. And it says, quote, zoned multifamily residential and business, this area constitutes Portland's melting pot and it's the nearest approach to a slum district in the city. 3/4 of the Negro population of the city reside here, and in addition, there are some 300 Orientals, 1,000 Southern Europeans, and Russians. Meanwhile, the one below in Kings Heights was green-lined and given a grade A+. And that one said, that deed restriction, it says, deed restrictions expired, but it is zoned single-family residential, which, with terrain and price levels, is believed to be ample protection. So now we come to the time when single-family zoning really expanded. And that comes with the 1943 Portland Improvement Plan, which had the aid of Robert Moses, which some of you may be familiar with. He was brought out from New York to help guide Portland's next planning process, and he suggested a lot of highway plans, but he also suggested that Portland reduce the amount of multifamily zoning to the smallest percentage absolutely necessary. So that was worked into those plans. And then in 1959, there was another update to the zoning code that further expanded the single family zoning. So between 1924 and 1959, 7.5 square miles were rezoned from multifamily to primarily single family. And then in 1959, an additional 6.75 square miles were changed from multifamily to R5, R7, or R10 single-family zoning in north, northeast, and southeast. So here we have the kind of federal and state changes that happened in the next couple decades. The 1960s and 70s were a period of increased community engagement in planning and development nationally. And this is a list of legal milestones of the era which affected Portland in different ways. The 70s saw the beginning of the Oregon land use system and the requirement for Portland to have a comprehensive growth management plan. Then the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibited discrimination in housing based on federally protected classes, race, color, religion, national origin. The Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 stated that financial institutions must provide credit assistance to all neighborhoods, especially those historically affected by redlining. And then these were national efforts to undo past harms, but the discrimination and segregation occurred. We're now going to move into the contemporary planning era, and Tom will take us there.
How many people were in Portland in the late 70s, lived in Portland in the late 70s? So I wasn't in Portland there, but I've learned a lot about it. But if you think back, so as Andrea said, in the early 70s, Oregon passed their statewide planning requirements. Cities were gearing up to adopt their comprehensive plans. And as part of that, Portland did in 1977, what was called a population strategy. And one of the things that was going on at that time and became a real concern was around white flight to the suburbs. And that white middle class families were moving out to single family homes in the suburbs. And the focus of the 1980 comp plan really became about housing and creating housing that's attractive to well-educated, employed, middle-class families. And what's interesting, so this was explicit about who we want to attract. What was interesting is part of all this population strategy was that there was a whole separate scenario option that was focused on social services and supporting the lower income population that was here and tending to the people that were in Portland. And that was discarded and discounted because it was deemed too expensive and that we couldn't figure out how to implement it. And so what that led to is in the 1980 comprehensive plan, we really have a transition in the way we thought about how the city would grow. And one of the leading concepts out of this is what they called back then was the noodles and nodes concept, in that density would be concentrated along our main commercial streets like Hawthorne and Belmont and Vancouver Williams, where it could be served by transit, and that in between those streets we would have single-family zoning to sort of preserve the neighborhood character in between those streets. And so, but this was really a pivot point because the zoning highlighted in blue circles here, the A1 and the A25, that was apartment zoning prior to 1980. And then after 1980, the areas in blue, and this is Ladd's Addition down here in the corner, and this is Hawthorne and Belmont. This is the Kearns neighborhood, Burnside and Sandy. And after 1980, all of that in blue got converted to some sort of single-family zoning. So 1980 was really sort of the last major expansion of single-family zoning in the city, even though the principle behind the plan was this idea of noodles and nodes and focusing density along major commercial streets. After the 1980 comp plan was adopted, I'm not sure what happened in the late 80s, but around 1980,
or late 80s and early 90s, we embarked on what we called the community planning program. And this was the idea that we would go in and take a chunk of the city and do a major community planning effort and do a lot of upzoning to implement this noodles and nodes concept and expand mixed-use commercial zoning, expand apartment zoning, multi-dwelling zoning. And we started right here in Albina. Well, the first one was the Central City Plan that we did in the late 80s. And then we moved to the Albina Plan. And then we went out and did the Outer Southeast Plan. And then we did the Southwest Plan. And there was huge controversy around expanding multifamily zoning in Southwest. And that was basically the end of that program. And so we did not get around to rezoning the rest of the city there. This is really sort of an example of disparate treatment between the Albina Plan and the Southwest Plan. Everything that you see in yellow is single-family zoning, and everything in blue and red are blue is multifamily zoning, and red is commercial mixed-use zoning. And what you can see here is that there was a lot of upzoning, as we call it in my profession, but an expansion of the multifamily zoning, especially on areas, and this is when we started to plan for the interstate light rail. And so what you see here, this is interstate here, and that whole area between interstate and the freeway was zoned for apartments. And really, what this came down to was really about political power, and that these neighborhoods, which had were predominantly African American, lower income, had less political power, and that when we finally got around to Southwest and tried the same sort of principles, applied the same sort of principles, we ran into white affluent neighborhoods that had a lot of political power to push back, and we wound up with a very different result. And the different result can be seen in that in the Albina Plan area since 2000, we've had about 8,500 new housing units. And in the Southwest planning area, there's only been about 4,000 new housing units. Most of those in the South Waterfront, South Portland neighborhood area. And this is demographics from 1990 and the share of people of color in those two areas. Each of those outlines is a census tract. In 2000, we adopted the Interstate Corridor Urban Renewal Area, and displacement and was prominent in that plan. We had a goal to protect existing residents from displacement. We had a goal to produce 2,000 units of affordable housing. We delivered less than 600 of those units. And really what it came down to is when the voters didn't approve funding for the light rail line, the north-south light rail line, the city decided to redirect urban renewal funds from housing to pay for the light rail extension. And as a result of that, and the failure to deliver on those units and to protect people from displacement, we've seen more than 4,000 African American households, about 10,000 people be displaced out of the neighborhood in this renewal area. In the mid-2000s, we have another turning point, transition point. If you remember back to the Potter administration, we did a citywide effort called Vision PDX. It was really focused on engaging the community, especially underrepresented groups, in sort of creating a shared vision for Portland, and it really came out on, and that's where we begin to see equity and access to opportunity and sustainability to become real themes and policy emphasis. And then Mayor Adams picked that up with a strategic planning process that we called the Portland Plan, and that really brought equity to the forefront as a major city policy initiative. We created the Office of Equity and Human Rights at that time, and it has really been a driving force in sort of our policy decisions and where we allocate funds and staff resources since the Portland Plan was adopted. Other things that were going on, and this gets back to the Fair Housing Act. The city is required every 3 to 5 years to do what's called an analysis of impediments to fair housing, and where we look at housing segregation and what's going on. And as Andrea explained, we really have transitioned from looking at discriminatory practices to being more proactive about increasing opportunities. And as part, in response to these findings, the city has done a lot to really forward that. And most of these have been undertaken by the Portland Housing Bureau. And it has been focused on sort of creating affordable housing, supporting the development of affordable housing, and then 3 years ago, we adopted what's called an inclusionary housing requirement, which means that developers of large multifamily buildings that have more than 20 units in it have to set aside 10 or 20% of the units as affordable housing at different income levels.
What does preference policy for Northeast Portland mean?
So that's a program and where run by the Housing Bureau, where when they build new housing units in this Albina neighborhood, if you were a family that was displaced from here, and many families were displaced out to East Portland and to the Rockwood area of Gresham, and you want to move back to the neighborhood, when they're sorting through the applications and trying to pick who gets the affordable unit, they give a preference to people with family connections or people who are directly displaced from this neighborhood to come back to the neighborhood.
So by Northeast Portland, you really mean inner Northeast Portland?
Yes.
Not at like...
No, the Albina area
like
where we're
Gateway
at.
or something like that.
Right.
Okay, got it.
Right, correct. Right on the heels of the Portland Plan, we started an update to our city's comprehensive plan. And this was the first time since 1980 that we basically took the plan apart and put it back together. And picking up on these themes, and with a lot of input and encouragement and working with a coalition of community groups that organized under the banner of Anti-Displacement PDX, we incorporated into the comprehensive plan a number of what we call equity policies that really have us, when we go to make a decision about applying zoning or investing in infrastructure or things like new transit lines to the Southwest Corridor along Barber, we really have to begin to look at who's benefiting and who's burdened by these decisions, and look at the demographics and how that is going to impact various people, and especially those lower income, renters, people of color, and people without college degrees. The people who are what we consider most vulnerable to price increases because we've upzoned a property or we built a light rail line and everybody wants to live near light rail now, and to really think about who's being impacted and how we can mitigate those impacts. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Andrea to talk a little bit about where we are today.
So we wanted to kind of wrap up showing you how the past decisions around zoning have implications for the way people live today. So we're going to show a few maps that just show the 1927 zoning for single-family homes and how they map onto, this is, for example, showing the highest 2 quintiles of percentage white population in Portland. They map on pretty closely, and a pattern of persistent patterns of inequity. They also map onto, for example, percentage of households living at above 140% of the median family income. And here we have a map showing the households vulnerable to housing insecurity. And we use 4 indicators to kind of be a proxy for housing insecurity. It's renter households, census tracts with higher percentages of low-income households, higher percentages of people of color, and higher percentages of people with without 4-year degrees from college. So you can see that the single-family home households, neighborhoods from 1927 have the lowest percentage of vulnerable households. And here we have the average mortgage interest deduction per claimant. And this is, one of the biggest housing subsidy programs that the government runs, essentially. And the beneficiaries, by and large, are those same single-family home zoned areas where the wealthiest homeowners in Portland claim the largest amounts of deductions. So when we talk about housing subsidies, we're not usually talking about this, but this is a huge one. So this one is the original red and green line maps. Those are the housing market trends for each of those areas. And as you can see, the green-lined areas consistently are still more, have tracked higher values historically. And what you see also is that the red-lined areas have been now more expensive than the yellow areas. And that's where we see gentrification and the effects of underinvestment and then a returning interest to those areas, for example, around the yellow line. So, and then finally, we wanted to show that in, I believe, 2016 or 2018, this shows the average black household. The median income for black households in Portland is $26,675, and that is no longer affordable. No neighborhood in Portland is now affordable to a household of making the median income for black households. If they were just spending 30% of their income, which is what we consider to be, a sustainable amount of your income to spend on housing. So Tom will wrap up.
Right, so, I think what we take from this in our bureau and bring to our planning projects is looking at how the zoning patterns still benefit white households, predominantly white households. Looking at recognizing the past harms that have been done to the black community and what we can do to mitigate those harms. And one of those big things is when you look at the data and think about success is this idea for a lot of families, the equity in their home is the wealth of the families, and that how home ownership has been a big part about wealth generation. And so what also can we do to support that going forward, especially for the black community and people of color. Which is why we've, at least in our bureau, have taken on zoning changes. We have almost rewritten the entire zoning code where housing is allowed. In the last 5 years, we've updated our mixed-use zoning code for commercial areas. We have updated just in December, the City Council passed a project to update the zoning code for multi-dwelling buildings. Right now, the City Council is considering what's called the Residential Infill Project, which affects single-family zoning, most of the single-family zoning in the city, to allow duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. But we recognize that zoning is not enough, that we have to look at our infrastructure investments and our housing policies and our housing investments. We as a city have stepped up and passed an affordable housing bond at the city level, an affordable housing bond at the region. Metro sponsored that bond. And so we are we are also right now working on what we call an anti-displacement action plan, where we are working with a coalition of community groups to look at different strategies and programs that can support households that are at risk or vulnerable to displacement. And we're trying to pull in all the other city bureaus into that conversation so that when we plan a big transportation project or a new park that makes a neighborhood nice and more attractive, what can we do to mitigate those impacts? And then finally, a couple of years ago, a number of African American community organizations got together and produced what they call the People's Plan. And in it, one of the themes that we've taken from it is back to the Fair Housing Act and this idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing by ending racial segregation from opportunity and providing community development and investment without displacement. And that's sort of our challenge that we are incorporating into our work today. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but and you have this presentation, but these are sort of what we want you to take away from this and you to reflect on and think about and to just think about what's compelling about this story and how you can use this knowledge either in the work of this committee or in your day-to-day life and to really think about how we as a city wound up here with our development pattern and how we interact and how we make investment decisions and how we grow in the future. Because we are planning for growth and we are expecting to continue to grow. And so these will be important themes that inform our decision making going forward.
We have some questions by the tents up, so Anthony first.
First of all, thank you for coming in and giving this really enlightening and powerful presentation. I think it's really good that we're talking about racialized displacement here. Jumping forward to the present day, could you describe the results of the city's analysis of potential displacement impacts from the residential infill project and clarify how it's most likely to affect the neighborhoods you identified in this presentation that have the highest housing insecurity?
Yeah, so as part of the residential infill, what we were looking at is neighborhoods. There's sort of a, how to put this, a mix or a cross-section of areas of town that are attractive for development. So if I build a new expensive house or a new expensive fourplex, I need to, construction costs are equal across the city, right? You go to Home Depot, you buy drywall and wood and framing, and you pay the laborers. It doesn't matter if you're building it in East Portland or in this neighborhood, it's going to cost about the same. And so where can I get rent for that new building that I can afford as a developer to make a profit? At the same time, factored into that is a land cost. You know, how much can I pay for the land, pay for the house, be able to rent it and make a profit? That's where I want to build. And so as part of our displacement analysis, we look for areas, where are the areas that have lower home values, but are in emerging areas that we're beginning to see rents rise that I could afford to pay and make a profit off of that new development. And our analysis shows that that area really is sort of a crescent, if you will, that sort of runs from the Cully neighborhood and down 82nd Avenue through Montevilla, Lentz, and Brentwood, Darlington. That when you get in the inner neighborhoods, property values, existing home values are too high. I as a developer, can't afford to buy a $600,000 home, tear it down, and build a fourplex and make money. If I get a little bit too far east, land values and home values are less, but if I buy that and I build that house, the rents that people right now want to pay to live in East Portland aren't enough to cover my construction costs. And so we begin to see just in the Montevilla and Lentz and Brentwood, Darlington neighborhoods that land value rent is just about right. And then if you really look at that area, there's a few neighborhoods where you actually have a concentration of more people of color and more people of color who rent single-family homes. And they're the ones that are most at risk at displacement. And that's where, as part of this, this anti-displacement strategy, we want to be able to target those housing support programs for those households, those people who rent single-family homes that are likely most at risk of displacement.
One more quick question. What in the anti-displacement plan would mark a change from what the city is already doing?
Well, we're still at the beginning of the process, and that's the purpose of the process, is to both inventory what the city is currently doing and looking at across the country to look at what other communities are doing and have a community conversation within the city to figure out what more can we do and what is appropriate for the city. And so it's an evolving plan and it's expected to go a continuing conversation over the next year.
Not being a native Portlander, I hadn't realized the amount. Sorry, not being a native Portlander, I hadn't realized the extent of demolition that came along with urban renewal here, especially in Legacy Manual. And if you look at what that used to look like in the communities that used to live there, I thought it would have been sort of valuable to have that in your presentation. I know that when this placarding ordinance came out, I feel like a lot of people, the Native American, African American community, was especially hit a nerve with this concern that they're going to get targeted again and the buildings get demolished. So I think that's an important. I hadn't known that. I don't know if everybody knows that. When you look at the photographs, I'd be pretty frightened too when all of a sudden they're looking at my URM building saying,
right,
it's going to fall down. We need to do something about it. And you're like, don't go near my building.
Right. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of history there. In some ways, we're trying to tell our story, the Bureau of Planning story, and that's an urban renewal story. Sort of not our agency. That's Prosper Portland's legacy to live with, and they've done some of that and acknowledged that legacy. But yeah, there is room to sort of do the city story as a whole.
That's a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
I hadn't realized that.
Yeah.
John? I'm glad to hear that the city's taking a larger view of race. 20 or 25 years ago, if you were talking about racial inequity, it would be African Americans, maybe Asians. But I think probably the largest group of non-whites is Latinas. But David Douglas has something like 100 languages spoken, Vietnamese and Ukrainians and so on. What's different? How do you react to that now?
I do think we are sort of considering it more of people of color and communities of color as a broader definition. However, I do think that when you look at some of the data and when you look at our legacy, it really has landed hardest on the African American community. And if you look at sort of the income disparities, that it's the African American households and the Native American households that earn about half of what white households earn. Latinx households are in between there. Actually, Asian households earn more than white households on average throughout the city of Portland. But it is designed to be more of a big tent approach.
Last call. You know, Tom, before you leave, maybe it would be great if we got you the URM maps where they exist, and you overlaid them on your cultural, racial, historical data, and then sent it to us, and then we'll present that at the next meeting to see what correlations, if any, are there. And I'll send you an email to remind you. Thank you both for your presentation. Very much appreciated. All right, I want to do a quick shout out to our caterer, Jay Peterson from Southern Grill Catering. Let's give him a round of applause. There he is. And if you frequent the Shine Distillery and Grill on February the 12th, he'll be playing with the Danielle Barker Band every Wednesday at 7. And I will, in our meeting notes, send out all of this information. And so, thank you again for a wonderful meal.
Thank you.
The Shine Distillery Grill is right up here on Skidmore. And just the things that you guys are talking about, I grew up in this neighborhood, going to Manual Hospital, very good example for the whole story, and it touches me a lot. Because it's just a lot going on, and I want to bring our community together. Things happen, but now we just got to go forward. And the guys at Shine Distillery, they're interested in trying to integrate our community. It's next door to where a historic jazz club was that only black people could play. It's the only place they could play in the city. Wow. James Brown, Miles Davis, the greats all played there. Wow. We're next door to where that venue was. It's called Geneva's. You guys can Google it. And I really would appreciate you guys to support the deal in this neighborhood. Skidmore and Williams every Wednesday night. And keep up with your work, you guys, and just let people know what's going on. Let's come together. We need each other. Yeah.
Looking at our fun-filled agenda here, it is at 20 minutes to 7. We're not going to be able to do overall city resilience.
That's fine.
At this point. We'll do it next time and hope we're resilient for another month. I want to do the public comment. And as far as the electing of the chairs and co-chairs, I just realized that under our bylaws, we don't have a quorum of nonprofit folks present. So we cannot vote on that. And it seems like if we're going to vote, we have questions that we're going to have one chair or two chairs and what have you. So I'm going to suggest we defer that. And then I need to end up with asking you where I started off on what further information you want to tease up the scope discussion, what other presentations you need before we have that and before you make a recommendation, if any, to City Council on what changes to the scope that you want. Does that seem reasonable to folks?
Are we gonna elect the chairs of the for-profit or no?
I think I'll defer because I'm not sure if we're going to do one chair, two chair at that time to do that. And then, and I'm worried about, I got the same software they were using in Iowa. And I'm a little anxious, Kathy.
Understandable.
I'm just saying, I'm a little sorry about this. So-
In future meetings,
Yes,
can
sir?
for the next meeting, can we schedule it earlier in the meeting so that we don't run out of time?
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. So, to get the comments, scheduled. All right, so public comment, I have, so far, unless there's someone in the back that hasn't done it, I have two people. I'll call them in the order they signed up. First Angie Even, and then second is Bill Eastman. And is there any other member of the public that wants to speak? Because I got to figure out how much time to allocate. So I have two. Is there a third? Hearing none. So what we're going to do.
Bill signed up before me. They must have got it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we'll do Bill first. Bill, why don't you come here, please, in this empty chair? We'll clean the place.
All right, this is a URM sort of focused thing because that's what it's called. But the last time this process was done, there were additional recommendations that were excluded from the final report. And so because there is no other way of considering them, we probably ought to consider what URMs are and what partial URMs are. We should think about soft story collapses, non-ductile concrete, liquefaction, utilities rupturing, electricity is off, gas mains are broken, transportation, the buses aren't working, there's no light rail. Because this is about earthquakes and it's framed to increase public safety. That's what I keep hearing. So that's just a kind of a big picture thing that seems to me like this committee is the only place where it could be considered because that's what you're here for, right? To consider the inevitable earthquake we've been promised. Now, the other thing is the current code has not been enforced properly. And if it is enforced properly and the triggers actually work, then these buildings will slowly get retrofitted or torn down and redeveloped. That's just the way it is. There's several people in this room who've had roof replacements, fully permitted and inspected, and nobody told us that we were supposed to do something. So that's number one. And number two is if you combine that with a voluntary refit program that's practical and affordable, I think you're well on your way to solving this problem. In my interactions with the city, I've had a lot of trouble getting things done on a timely manner, clear communication, and inexpensive or affordable results. And it's been consistent over the last 20 years. So there seems to be a systemic issue that I hope can be resolved. I went to Canada. I have a URM. It's on the list. And I just got my rapid visual survey yesterday. And right at the bottom, the concluding page, it's marked reinforced masonry. But I'm on the URM list. Now, I approached Mr. Kumar, and he says, yes, you are on the list. And you'll remain on the list until you prove to us that it should be off the list. So, indeed, we are guilty until proven innocent. Thinking about that over the last 3 years, I have been looking for alternatives that are affordable. There's a place in Arizona that has a product called Quake Wrap. You essentially roll on, think of it as wallpaper. You put an epoxy on a prepared substrate, your sandblasted building, or bricks, whatever it is. Mine's concrete block. Then you put on the carbon fiber, and then you put more epoxy on top of it. And that's $40 a square foot. That's the price they gave me, my first estimate. And he's willing to do the engineering and do it. But can we get the city that works to approve it? That's the question. The Army Corps of Engineers has been using it for 20 years. So what bureaucratic hurdles do we need to jump through to adopt modern technology? 2 years ago in Canada, an engineering professor worked with a team of graduate students and developed an eco-friendly ductile concrete composite that he sprays on buildings, and then you can either stamp it or you can trowel it out smooth or make decorative finishes, whatever you want to do. None of this stuff. And I drove up to Canada to look at a finished project. It was an elementary school built in 1920. It was bricks. And they coated that whole school, and it wasn't even necessary to move the kids. They could go to school. They chose to do it in the summertime because of the weather. But these are the kind of non-intrusive, modern technologies that exist today and will continue to be developed. So do we have a city that can actually adopt some of these things? Because everyone knows money's a problem. So, I read somewhere, what was the cost to retrofit Benson High School? What's the figure? Does anybody remember how many hundreds of dollars per square foot? Well, that's crazy.
It's 800 per square foot, over 800 million.
How much?
800 per square foot.
800 per square foot. So, doesn't $40 a square foot sound better? There's a lot of bang for the buck if we can get it allowed. So, thank you very much for listening. I will send Mr. Kumar the floor plans and the detailed blueprints of my building showing the steel reinforcement. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have a question to ask him? Go ahead, quickly.
Sir, why don't you provide the committee information on those two processes which you talked about?
I can send it in an email. I can make some attachments with YouTube videos. As you can see, I'm a simple man. I'm not in IT. I can operate Google at a very low level, very low level. So I will send it to the URMS.
Right here, send it to me.
Send it to you. All right.
Because if that is an option for us to consider, it could be something which we would recommend to the city.
Yeah.
To follow up on. We could do that.
Yeah.
Okay, if we feel.
I'm hoping that does happen.
Okay, then please share the information with Sam and you share it with us. Okay?
I'm not a researcher. I'm not an engineer or a high-tech researcher in such things. I'm willing to bet that other people in this room could use their computer and find out other technologies in addition to this. I also found, cross-laminated timber, which is very popular in Europe as a way of fighting the earthquake problem. So there's a bunch of technologies out there that I don't see in Portland and nobody offers as code compliant.
So just send me what you have, and I'll bundle it up. I'll send it to everybody, the city and here,
Okay.
and then we can.
And I'll send you the name of the principals of those two companies, so that you have actual names and phone numbers and email addresses.
Right. And if you could have at least 14 footnotes, that would be ideal. All right, next up, where's Angie? Oh, here. So introduce yourself and take it away.
Hi, my name's Angie Even, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard my name. And it's because I was one of the very first people that showed up at the very first meeting that was sent out in a postcard in 2016. When we went to that meeting, we started asking questions because the way that the postcard was framed, it was an informational meeting. And I had read the policy, went online, and I went up to the podium and I started asking questions, and the policy committee wasn't answering them. And at first I got angry because I thought they were just being defiant and didn't want to answer. But I sat there, and if you look in the policy draft, you can see me in the back, leaning over a table, watching all the testimony, or all the people asking questions that were the building owners, and I realized they didn't have the answers. That's different. So we started asking questions, and we started insisting that we get answers. One of the answers we wanted to have, of which when we went through how the committees were formed the first time, was that it was 2 years and 8 months from the time the first committee met until they sent that postcard out. 2 years and 8 months. So were we surprised? Yeah. And were we alarmed when they told us that was a September meeting and it was going to City Council in November? We were alarmed. So we started going to meetings and we started asking questions, and here we are. We went through 3 years of process. We went through a federal lawsuit in federal court, of which on 4 counts the building owners won. And we're here now, and we have the same problem. There is no plan, and there is no funding. And I think Marshall Runkle and Commissioner Hardesty's office put it the best. This is a math problem. And until we figure out the funding, there is no how. It's not if, it's how. And, I have just a little bit about myself. I've worked for over 30 years on Woodstock's Main Street. I'm the president of a nonprofit called the Woodstock Stakeholders Group, and what we do is we work on livability issues and inclusiveness and those types of things in the neighborhood. I'm the past business association president. My breadth of experience is more than just being a building owner. And so when I looked at this, I saw 1,600, people saw 1,650 buildings, but I saw 95 neighborhoods. And when you look at the number of buildings in each neighborhood, say for instance Hawthorne, where there's over 40, or Montevilla, where there's 55, or St. John's, where there's 57, or you go and you go and you go. And you look at that and you see just the absolute decimation of those main streets if there is no plan and there is no funding. Now you guys are asking the questions, why does the list matter? Well, it matters because these buildings have had immense pressure put on them by the city of Portland putting them on a list. They've lost their earthquake insurance, some of them. They've been on the market for months out from when they should have been as far as being able to sell. They are untouchable. And so, you take that and then you take the placarding ordinance where Commissioner Saltzman, under oath in court, says that was to put economic pressure on the building owners. And you'll understand why we're a little combative. We're combative because we've been through 3 years, and Mr. Eastman finally got his records after
2 years.
2 years when the attorney for the placarding suit emailed Sam and said, hey, what's up? Why isn't Ammon answering this guy? And we shouldn't have to be in that position because the people, one committee member of the last committee put it really well. He said, the city should be thanking these people for their investment in the neighborhoods, their investment in the city, being the stewards of these old buildings. And as long as we have the list, which is inaccurate, and Mr. Cousins and Mr. Kumar and Shelley and Jonna, wherever you are, I think you are unwittingly spreading the message in the press and in your emails that that list is accurate. And I would ask you to sit down with me and let's go through Mike Hagerty's testimony in court. And it's not. They only looked at the downtown buildings. That's it. And this, I have a whole list of things, but maybe I can get to talk another time. I think what I'm going to say is this. My parents, I grew up in Portland. I was born here in 1959 in Emmanuel Hospital. And I grew up in the Park Rose area in the Northeast. I'm an East Side girl, always have been. And I remember when my parents in the 80s got the letter from the city of Portland, of which said they owed $30,000 to attach to the sewer system. And my parents cried, and they panicked, and they did not know what they were going to do because they'd paid $18,000 for their house in Park Rose in the 60s, and all of a sudden they were going to have to come up with $30,000 in order to have comply with an ordinance that the city of Portland was handing down on them. I'd like you all to fast forward to 2016 when they published that list. And they didn't publish it until 2016. And when they did that, they did the same thing. They targeted these people. They put pressure on them. They've built this cloud. And what I liken it to when I talk to you, I'm 60 years old and I'm a young building owner, or I've been a young building owner in this process. And I'm one of the younger ones. And that's why I decided to take on being sort of the spokesperson, because I have the energy plus I have the time. But I've watched my friends over the years get the awful diagnosis of cancer. And they told them that they had to go through all these treatments in order to try to be in the fight of their lives. And for these building owners, that a list that was published in 2016 to drop this on their retired, most of them, or low-income burden onto them, they now have to face those same realities that if they can't afford it, they can't fix it. And when the city says things like, we're going to get, or maybe we've got a chance of getting SB 311, Mr. Bay, it does not cover condos. It also sunsets in 2028. It also is only for retrofits above 2485. You add all those things up and go ahead and get it, but nobody's going to be able to use it, and it's going to displace every small business and every tenant. And I think my closing argument in this is that I have the weight of the people that are counting on me to be the spokesperson and have been. And I don't know if, Mr. Bay, if you know this, but according to an email from Shelley Hack in public records request, which we have 14,000 emails,
Take your time.
there's 1,500 condos. That is now on your shoulders. Just like the building owners are on mine. And same with any of the small people, maybe Mr. Chown. He's from Portland Business Alliance. 1,400 of these buildings are small commercial buildings. Those people are on your shoulders. So to take a broad brush on this is a real misstep, and I think that I can do all this later, but please just understand that although we've been framed as the opposition, this entire project has put us into fight or flight, and the ones that are left, we're still fighting. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. I don't know where the thing is, but I'll try to project without it. Please remember you can send emails to urms@portlandoregon.gov. We'll get them. You can also communicate with me directly. That is fine as well. Get this on real quickly. So, trying to close the loop then on what I started, I want to call your attention to this slide. And so this is really the what further substantive information do you, the work group members, recommend that we present at meeting 3 so that you will have sufficient base level information. We'll never be able to get to all of the details, but a base level of information such that you may consider making a recommendation surrounding to what extent you want to change the scope consistent with those slides I presented in the beginning. Now, having said that, that was just a draft, an attempt at the high level to frame it up. I suspect your homework will be a more modified version of that and asking you to give us your recommendations so we can tee up that scope issue. But please consider, I'm not trying to nudge you to the left or to the right, but if some of the changes that you might recommend or I've heard that could be recommended will mean we don't have the right people around this table at the room. Because if we're doing class 1 and class 2, we need other folks. So they have representation just like the people here do. We may need other bureaus, the county, FEMA, if we're talking overall resiliency. Don't let that restrain you. Just consider, and this is why that chart sort of lays it up. Here's what the scope said. Here's what I, Sam, think I've heard. Here's some considerations. That's not in stone. That is just something for you to push against and get back to. But I do want to give you the opportunity to tell us what you think are essential presentations before we proceed. And given the time, I'll be a little more Sam-like than usual. And one is on the financial pieces. Is there really money? Are these programs that were outlined in the slides and the various options, are they really viable or not? We kind of like put it in the air, here it is, some comments back and forth, but I don't think we gave it the attention it deserves to dive into, whatever. Like right now, here, standing in the moment, I don't know if Senate Bill, whatever the hell it is, applies to condos or not. I want to get more information, surrounding that so we can play with the facts. So I'm suggesting we will give information on the financial pieces and the city funding. Does anyone think that's a bad idea? Anyone says, no, don't present on that. So I think everyone wants us to present on that, so that makes sense as a logical flow. Yes, sir.
I'm not a financial wizard. Okay? I have a master's in finance, though. Okay, okay, but
unbelievable. Go on.
But financing by the city or by the state is something which requires expertise in that area. I don't have that expertise. Okay, so to have any one of us discuss financing, okay, is not the right source of information. We need somebody from the city financial establishment, okay, to whom we can ask questions and who can say this is what it is. Otherwise, you're just guessing.
Vic, your wish is my command. Would you do the Rose Festival wave for us and introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Bridget O'Callahan. I'm the city treasurer. We also have the city's debt manager here with us for most of the evening as well, just listening to this. We're new to this process, so this is all new information for us, so we're learning it as you are.
And we're going to try to get them at the next meeting or the fourth meeting.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Jennifer Cooperman came into a listening session meeting with building owners in March of 2019. Her purpose was to tell us that it was illegal for the city of Portland to do any funding, financing, or any financial support of these buildings.
There are some challenges around that.
Okay, now I got the statement from Derek Bradley, and it is very clear
Let it talk.
that the city is not going to, or says they cannot, do anything towards these buildings. I also have these emails, the emails, that's kind of a joke anymore, but is that Jennifer Cooperman is in those emails saying that she wants the city money to go towards city buildings first, and low-income housing second. Now, I tend to agree with that, but we need to be clear about what is being said and then what is being said, because those are two different things. The city is saying they are not going to support these buildings, and they're actually citing state statute that it's illegal.
And that is true.
Okay, thank you.
That is true. But we're trying to get creative and look at alternatives. At the end of the day, the source of funding is the challenge.
Yep.
And so that's what we're trying to dig into with Sam and the group here, and certainly open to anyone's ideas for how we approach this.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Sorry about that.
Sure.
But since you're here, I just wanted everybody to know that's where we are.
So follow-up request for when we're talking about buildings, I'm assuming that the conversation is, this conversation must be about private building owners, because as a nonprofit agency, we absolutely receive city funding for affordable housing upgrades to our...
It all depends on the source of the funding.
Okay.
So just clarifying that's the
We're
differentiation.
simplifying this, and you're right, there are other scenarios that we could certainly talk about. The private building owners, there are some challenges.
Okay.
Will this come as a homework assignment?
Yeah, if you ever get home. I mean, I just can't promise you're going to get home tonight. Look at folks. So let me ask, by show of hands, meaning yes, you would want to. How many of you would like a presentation on earthquake risks? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. How about building risks? How buildings perform? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. We'll deal with liability finance options, city funding, and the other options. That was just a poll. It's not non-voting. You don't have to worry about your conflict of interest forms, what have you. Kathy, did you have something?
Well, were you going to ask for other things that we'd like to hear about?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for getting it. What other things would you like to hear?
I think one obvious thing is what Bill brought up, is what other options are out there, other than, trying to put steel beams in a brick building.
Okay, so
I think there's lots of other
fixes, other mechanical, non-mechanical, super glue.
The last one? Or is that?
I didn't hear you. Under other. I'm just taking other options.
Okay.
For conversation.
Okay.
So I'm adding that to the list. Dave.
So I think that would be good too, to have maybe Jennifer go through some of the projects that she's done for seismic retrofits, the design of those, and then, you know, maybe have Robert go through some of the seismic retrofits that he's actually done from a contractor standpoint. I would love to see that presentation.
And to second that with real costs,
Okay.
not just hypothetical.
And that as well.
Yeah. Like
How
case
much
studies.
it costs.
Yeah, case studies.
If I may, I mean, more than happy to share as much information as I possibly can and the experience they have, but one of the things you'll see is, and I would imagine be very frustrating, is the broad spectrum of what those costs look like. Because every building is really its own building.
Yeah.
And vastly differs from each other and what the requirements are from a structural standpoint, from a construction standpoint, occupied, non-occupied. It is very hard to gain some type of understanding of what an average cost could be. And I would almost say lead you down the wrong path of understanding.
Yeah, the city seemed comfortable with averages, so maybe we could do a min, median, max, whatever.
Or do it by quartiles or something, you know, like the easiest 20% cost is the next easiest, something more granular.
Yeah.
I mean, because an average is just all over the map.
Yeah.
If you can give us case studies of some real buildings in different classifications, I think that would be maybe more instructive than an average.
We can show you a city
Multi-story
case study.
versus single-story.
Okay, well, let's talk one at a time so she can get the notes down and not quit after her first day on the job, which this is her first day on the job. I hope not her last. Anthony.
I would like to have a meeting at some point where we could more specifically discuss specific ways of preventing tenant displacement and ways of protecting tenant quality of life during retrofits. I would love to have a presentation from like the Rental Services Office and the Bureau of Development Services about current tenant protections in that regard. I've already talked about this in the homework from last week though.
Don.
One of the things I think to bring up is before you talk about retrofit options is to really define what level of code upgrade you expect to happen for a URM building, given soil conditions, given the age of the structure, given the structure, given anomalies in the structure. There could be soft stories, it could be extremely high parapets, whatever, because that is going to be the bigger determinant of the cost and the retrofit than anything else you're going to do. So in other words, you have to bring an unreinforced masonry building up to current code. You can't afford it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so part of that is to really understand what level upgrade you want to have happen for those different URM buildings that are out there. Half of them are one story.
Yep.
So behind tab 2, at the end, there's a meeting evaluation. If you don't have time to fill it out, just sign it and I'll fill it out for you. And I can guarantee the results, but seriously do that. But let's keep in mind when you get out this homework, what are we doing here, folks, if there's not likely to be any money? The greatest plan in the history of work groups, even if you had a competent facilitator, it doesn't get us to the end of the game here. So let's think about that objectively and ask what we're doing. Yes?
So just one big missing piece that I see in the makeup of this committee is to have people who know something about getting money from the state and the federal level. I mean, I've heard people throw around things like seismic tax credits. I don't even know if that's a real thing. I don't know if it exists. I don't know how to go get it. But somebody who knows how to get funds or to ask for funds from the state and the federal level, that's where I think if there's any hope of any money, that's where I guess what might come from. So somebody who has those expertise.
Did anyone from the state government get five? Yeah, there's 550 unreinforced masonry buildings on the National Historic Registry. And so maybe somebody from the National Park Service, because they have some funding allocated for projects. If we had somebody that could tell us something like that.
Just going off of what Kathy said, is it possible for someone from the state and federal agencies that administer those sorts of programs to come present to us?
We got it up, to put it on our list, and we'll follow up and see. Don, did you have something else?
No.
Vic, you have something?
Yeah, so we keep on talking about financial options. Both of these gentlemen have been in the same committee for over 15 years. 15 years?
25.
25 years. 25 years. In 25 years, there has been no funds. Zero. Okay? So the point is, okay, how does it make that there is no money? If there was money, okay, we would have known by now. We would have a definitive thing from the city saying we have this money. We cannot say that. So why are we going around and around? There is no money.
Okay, last call. Yeah, did you have something?
Just one point.
And your name, so the record.
Reno Josen, developer, contractor. The one thing we're all talking about is a solution, but I think we first have to figure out the real number of URMs that have to be retrofitted and identify them, because maybe some of these people in these rooms, this room that's worried about finances, don't need to upgrade their building. But if we have this kind of history involved with this type of committee, we should be able to narrow down and figure out which of these buildings are or are not URMs. From the historic archives in the Bureau of Development Services to information that the original homeowners may have somewhere. Maybe we're spinning our wheels. Maybe this number is only 800. It's a number that nobody can prove that these are all actually buildings that need to be retrofitted.
Okay. Anyone want to stay an extra hour or two tonight? No? Really? Go forth, do good, avoid evil. Thank you much. See you next month.
Nice job, Sam.
Thank you.
Yes.